I didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. Kangmin Jae looked at the woman who had just pressed her lips against his. A stranger. A stranger who smelled like cheap champagne and something underneath it. Something that almost reminded him of a person he used to be. And he set down his glass with the quiet deliberateness of a man who had ended lives with less ceremony than that. The bodyguards moved. Of course they moved. They always moved. He stopped them with 2 fingers. "Leave her," he said, in Korean. And then, because he wanted her to understand exactly what she had done, he said it again in English. "Leave her." Amara Bennett stood her ground. Her knees were shaking. She would admit that later, much later, in a moment she never expected to have. But her spine did not curve. She had spent 37 years learning how to stand in rooms where she was not supposed to exist. And whatever this was, wherever this had gone wrong, she was not going to fold in front of a man whose name she did not even know yet. She had no idea that not knowing his name was the only mercy the night had left to give her. If you've ever made one decision, just one, and felt the ground shift under you the moment it was done, then you already know how Amara felt in that club. You already know what it costs to stand still when everything in you is screaming to run, stay with her, because where this goes next, no one saw coming. And before we go further, if this story already has you holding your breath, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. Subscribe if you haven't, and don't go anywhere. Because what happens next is the kind of thing people spend the rest of their lives trying to explain. The dare had started the way most bad ideas start, with laughter, with wine, and with the particular cruelty that close friends are allowed to exercise on each other because they've earned it. There were 4 of them at the table in the elevated VIP lounge section of Knox, the kind of nightclub in West Hollywood that didn't advertise, didn't take walk-ins, and whose name you only learned when someone who mattered gave it to you. Jasmine had gotten them in through a client connection, which was how Jasmine got into most things. She was 39, a corporate attorney, and she moved through the world as though obstacles were simply poorly worded suggestions. Next to her was Priya, who had been Amara's closest friend since a disastrous graduate school study group that had somehow survived 11 years in 3 cities. Then there was Kemi, who was visiting from London and had already decided she was going to embarrass Amara at least twice before her flight Sunday morning. And then there was Amara. Amara, who had signed her divorce papers 8 days ago. Amara, who had spent the first 3 of those days sitting in her apartment eating crackers and watching weather forecasts for cities she had no intention of visiting. Amara, who had agreed to this night out with the specific emotional energy of someone who has decided to perform happiness until it becomes real. She was wearing the burgundy dress Jasmine had picked out, the one with the open back that Amara had spent 20 minutes arguing against before putting on. She had done her makeup in the car because she couldn't make herself do it at home, in the bathroom where Daniel's aftershave still clung to the grout in the tile. She looked good. She knew she looked good. That was its own exhausting kind of grief, looking good on a night when what you actually wanted was to be invisible. "Okay," Kemi said, leaning forward with the expression of someone who has been waiting all evening for exactly this moment. Dare. Amara had chosen dare deliberately. She'd chosen it the way you choose to go off the high dive. Not because you aren't afraid, but because you already know you're too scared to let yourself hesitate. Kemi's gaze moved across the room with unhurried calculation. Priya was already covering her mouth. Jasmine set down her glass. "Him," Kemi said. Amara followed the line of Kemi's chin. The man was sitting at a private table on the far side of the club, separated from the general population by the kind of invisible perimeter that exists in any room where someone dangerous is present, and everyone has quietly registered the fact. There were 3 men near him who were not sitting because they were enjoying the music. There was a 4th man standing by the stairs who Amara recognized, in the diagnostic part of her brain that was always working, as someone whose job was to see threats before they materialized. The man at the table was very still. He was Korean, tall, even-seated, dressed in a dark suit that was not flashy, but was clearly expensive in the way that things are expensive when they don't need to announce themselves. His face was angular and composed, and he was looking at the room with the patient attention of someone who does not watch for entertainment, but for information. There was a glass in front of him that he had not touched in a while. He was, without question, the most intimidating person in the building. Amara knew this the way she knew the temperature of a room when she walked into it. instinctively, before conscious thought had time to form an opinion. Absolutely not, she said. Those are the rules, Kemi said, smiling with the serenity of someone whose flight home was Sunday. Kemi, you picked dare. I thought you were going to make me talk to a bartender. I thought you were going to pick truth, Priya said, which was not helpful. You have to go kiss him, Kemi said. On the lips, not a peck, a real one. And you have to walk up there like you meant to. Amara looked across the room. The man had not looked in their direction. He was listening to the man on his left, who was speaking quietly and seriously, and whatever was being said was holding his entire attention with the quality of someone absorbing a report, not a conversation. The rational part of Amara's brain produced a clear and organized list of reasons not to do this. The list was long. Several items on it involved the word security. The other part of her brain, the part that had spent 8 days in an apartment eating crackers and watching the Weather Channel, the part that had written and deleted 14 text messages to Daniel and sent none of them, the part that was sick of being careful and small and braced for impact, said something else entirely. She pushed back her chair. If I get thrown out, she said, you're all coming with me. She didn't run the distance. She didn't hesitate dramatically. She crossed the room at a pace that her professional brain recognized as the same tempo she used when walking into a boardroom where she was not expected and not particularly welcome, purposeful, controlled, the walk of someone who had already decided the outcome. The bodyguard near the stairs clocked her. She watched him calculate. She didn't break pace. The bodyguard nearest the table stood up by the time she was 4 feet away, and she made eye contact with him and said quietly and directly, 1 minute, I'll be done in 1 minute. He was surprised enough by the certainty in her voice that he didn't move in time. She was already there. The man at the table looked up when she placed her hand on the edge of it. Up close, his eyes were darker than she'd registered from across the room, and the stillness she'd observed from a distance was not remotely passive. It was the stillness of something compressed, like the moment before weather. She didn't explain herself. She didn't apologize. Those were both reflexes she was actively fighting, and she won. She leaned in, and she kissed him. It lasted approximately 3 seconds. Her hand was still on the table. His hands didn't move. He didn't flinch or pull back, but he didn't respond either, and in the last half second of those 3 seconds, she felt something she hadn't expected, the quality of his attention. All of it, like being the only object in a focused beam of light. She stepped back. His expression had not changed exactly, but something had shifted inside it. Some minor recalculation happening behind his eyes that she couldn't read and did not like not being able to read. The bodyguard was behind her now. Sir, he said, a question disguised as a statement. The man at the table looked at the bodyguard. Then he looked back at Amara with the same measuring quality he'd used on the room earlier, except now the room was just her. Leave her, he said, first in Korean, then in English. Leave her. Amara didn't move. Her knees were shaking. Her knees were absolutely, unambiguously shaking, and she was furious at herself for it, but she did not bend. He picked up his glass. Sit down, he said. Not loud. Not commanding in the theatrical sense. It was the voice of someone who does not expect to repeat themselves. I'm not staying, she said. That was a dare. I'm sorry if it was... Sit down. The same tone, the same volume. I didn't say stay, I said sit. The distinction was enough to buy 30 seconds of confusion, and in those 30 seconds, she sat. He studied her the way she imagined he studied most things. Without apparent hurry, without apparent emotion, with the specific quality of attention that suggested he was not seeing what she showed him, but something underneath it. Who put you up to it? He said. Not a question. My friends. Which ones? Over there. She tilted her head in the direction of the booth, where she could see Jasmine's hand over her mouth and Kemi's enormous grin and Priya apparently recording something on her phone. I'm going to kill them later. He followed her gesture, looked at the table for exactly 2 seconds, looked back. You could have refused, he said. I know. But you didn't. No. Another beat of that compression. Then, why? Amara opened her mouth and closed it again. Because she was 8 days out of a marriage she should have left 3 years earlier, and she was so tired of being cautious, so tired of calculating risk and making careful choices and still ending up with nothing to show for it. And a stranger who scared everyone in a room felt, in some broken and specific way, like the one risk that was entirely her own. She didn't say any of that. What she said instead was, "I don't know. I made a choice, and I didn't think it through, and now I'm here." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something that had considered becoming a smile and decided against it. "Go back to your friends," he said. She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress, which was a nervous habit she immediately regretted. "I really am sorry if I—" "You're not in trouble," he said. He was already looking back at the man on his left, who had been sitting frozen and motionless throughout this entire exchange with the particular stillness of someone who was not going to volunteer opinions on what had just happened. "You have no idea what you just started. Go back to your friends." She went back to her friends. Kemi was already ordering shots. Priya was still recording. Amara sat down, accepted the shot glass when it arrived, and drank it without ceremony. "Well?" Jasmine said. "He told me to leave," Amara said. "But you didn't leave immediately," Kemi said. "You sat down. We all watched you sit down." "He also told me to sit." "And you did." "He has a very certain kind of voice," Amara said, which was the most honest thing she could think of that also revealed nothing, and she spent the rest of the night drinking exactly enough to stop replaying those 3 seconds, which meant she did not drink enough. She did not know his name. She went home without asking. She told herself the whole thing would feel like a ridiculous story by Tuesday, the kind of thing you mention to someone at a party 3 years later and everyone laughs. She slept badly. She dreamed about the quality of his attention. She woke up at 5:30 and made coffee and stood at her kitchen window and watched the sky go gray and then pink and told herself she was fine. She had been telling herself she was fine for 8 days. It was not getting more convincing. She was in the office by 8:15. The office being, technically, her office, Bennett Strategic Communications, which she had built over 6 years into a mid-sized crisis management firm with 12 employees, a client list that included 4 Fortune 500 companies and 1 sitting congressman, and a reputation for being the person you called when the story had already broken and all the other people you'd called first had made it worse. She was proud of the company. It was the thing she had made entirely by herself, without Daniel's help or Daniel's money or Daniel's carefully expressed supportive concern, which she had understood only in retrospect was never about her success and always about maintaining the comfortable fiction that he was the kind of man who wanted his wife to succeed. Marcus was already at his desk when she arrived. Marcus was her operations manager, her business partner of 4 years, and the person she trusted more than almost anyone else in the professional architecture of her life. He was also visibly uncomfortable. "Good morning," she said. "Yeah," he said, which was not Marcus's normal register. Marcus's normal register was organized and brisk and slightly impatient with people who moved slower than necessary. Can you come to your office?" "I was planning to," she said. "It's my office." "There are people already in it," he said. She stopped. "What kind of people?" she said. Marcus had the specific expression of someone who has spent the last 40 minutes wishing they could simply not be present for the next part. "The kind," he said carefully, "that made me feel like I should probably call you before you walked in, and I should have, and I'm sorry I didn't." Amara looked at the closed door of her own office. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, she could see the shapes of people, more than one. The rational part of her brain started producing assessments. The part of her that had been running crisis communications for 6 years started cataloging. She thought, without knowing why, about a man at a table who had watched her cross the room and then told her she had no idea what she had just started. She thought about that for exactly 4 seconds. Then she straightened her jacket and put her hand on the door. 3 lawyers. 2 men who were very clearly not lawyers. A woman with a tablet who appeared to be taking notes on everything, including Amara walking in. And in her chair, behind her desk, a single document. No one was sitting in her chair. It was just the document, placed in the center, with the deliberateness of something that had been left rather than forgotten. She crossed the room, picked it up. It took her 90 seconds to read it, and she read it twice, and the second time her hands were very steady because she had decided they were going to be. The document was a transfer of controlling interest in Bennett Strategic Communications. The former co-owner, Marcus, who had held a 40% stake, had, as of 7 o'clock that morning, signed over his entire share to a holding company called Junhua Capital Group. Junhua Capital Group was privately held, unlisted, and organized under a structure she didn't immediately recognize. She set the document down. She looked at the woman with the tablet. "Who," she said, "authorized this?" The woman said, without looking up from her notes, "Mr. Kong will be here at 9. The room was very quiet. Amara heard her own breathing. She heard Marcus, somewhere behind her, make a sound that wasn't quite an apology but was in that neighborhood. And then she thought about dark eyes that had measured her with the patience of someone who does not hurry because they have never needed to, and a voice that said she had no idea what she had just started. She looked at the clock on the wall. It was 8:42. She had 17 minutes. She did not run. She did not panic. She set the transfer document back on the center of her desk where she had found it, pulled out her chair, and sat down in it. If Kong Min Jae was coming at 9, she would be exactly where she was supposed to be when he arrived. She had spent 6 years learning how to be the person in the room who was already prepared. She had never needed it more. She thought about the kiss. She thought about how it had lasted 3 seconds, and how she had thought, walking back to her friends, that it was over. She thought about a man studying her with the patience of a long calculation, and the way he'd said those words without heat or drama. "You have no idea what you just started." Her computer screen reflected her face back at her. Her makeup was good. Her expression was controlled. She looked like someone who was not afraid. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the divorce papers. She thought about 8 days of crackers and weather forecasts, and all the ways she had tried to convince herself that the worst was already behind her. The clock moved. 8:43. Amara Bennett straightened the document on her desk, folded her hands, and waited. He arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. Not 8:59, not 9:01. 9 o'clock, which told Amara something she filed away without comment. This was a man who controlled time the way other people controlled language, as a tool, deployed precisely, to communicate something that had nothing to do with punctuality. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, the quality of silence that preceded him. The lawyers stopped their quiet murmuring. The two men who were not lawyers straightened incrementally. The woman with the tablet looked at the door and then looked at her screen, which Amara read as the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to be caught watching him enter a room. The door opened. Kong Min Jae wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open by exactly one button. He carried nothing. He had no phone in his hand, no briefcase, no folder. He walked in like a man who had never needed props to establish what he was. And he looked at Amara the moment the door was fully open, before he looked at anyone else in the room, with the same quality of attention she remembered from the night before, complete, unhurried, and entirely without apology. He sat down across from her desk, not beside it, not at an angle, directly across in the chair that put the desk between them, which she recognized as a choice. He was telling her this was a meeting, not a confrontation. The distinction felt thin. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "Mr. Kang." She kept her hands flat on the desk. "I've read the transfer document." "Good. I have questions." "I expected you would." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them moved. "Marcus held 40% of this company," she said. "He couldn't have transferred it without a triggering event. There's a clause in our partnership agreement. Section 12, subsection C, Min Jae said. Insolvency trigger. If either partner's personal financial obligations exceed a threshold that materially compromises their capacity to fulfill fiduciary duties to the company, the other partner has the right of first refusal, and in the absence of that refusal, the interest converts and becomes transferable." Amara said nothing. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was standing near the window with the expression of a man who had spent the last hour being very carefully and methodically disassembled and was now mostly just holding himself upright by habit. "Marcus," she said. "Amara, how much?" He closed his eyes. 840,000. The number landed in the room like something physical. "Personal debt," she said. "Gambling," he said, and the word cost him. She could see it cost him. "Sports betting, mostly, some other things. It built up over about 3 years, and I kept thinking I could—" "3 years," she said. "Amara, you've been carrying $800,000 in gambling debt for 3 years, and you didn't say anything to me. I was going to fix it. You didn't fix it. Someone else found it." She looked at Min Jae. "You found it. It wasn't difficult to find, Minjay said, without any particular satisfaction in the statement. It was just a fact. He owed money to 4 different creditors. 2 of them are known to us. When we acquired his debt, the clause in your partnership agreement activated. He had 72 hours to buy it back. He didn't have the resources. So you bought my company. I bought 40% of your company, he said. 40% that was already effectively insolvent. You still hold 60%. You're still the majority owner. A 40% silent partner I never agreed to is not a technicality I'm going to be comfortable with. I'm not going to be silent, he said. The room was very quiet. Amara picked up the transfer document and set it back down in exactly the same place. It was a thing she did when she needed 5 seconds to think without looking like she needed 5 seconds to think, and she'd done it enough that it had become invisible, except that Minjay watched her do it with the expression of someone who had just seen a tell they would not forget. "What do you want?" she said. "Crisis management. I'm a PR firm." "I know what you are." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms resting on his thighs, and she noticed for the first time that there was a scar along the back of his left hand, old and clean, the kind that comes from something deliberate rather than accidental. "My organization has legitimate business interests that have been under increasing media pressure for the past 8 months. 3 investigative journalists, 2 of them with major outlets, are building narratives about Junhua Capital's connections to activities that would be damaging if framed incorrectly. And you want me to manage the narrative. I want you to make it manageable," he said. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Managing a narrative means controlling the story you tell. Making it manageable means changing what the story is." He held her gaze. "You've done the second thing before. I've read your case history. My client work is confidential." "Most of it," he said. "Not all." And there it was. The thing she had been waiting for since 8:43. The specific gravity of it. The way certain conversations had a weight at the center that you could feel before you arrived at it. She didn't let herself look away. "What specifically," she said, "have you read?" "Renner Group," he said. 2021. 17 employees who filed OSHA violations that were buried before they reached the state level. You managed the communications for their executive team during the regulatory review. That's not Alston Pharmaceuticals, 2022. Clinical trial data that was selectively presented to the FDA. You managed the press release and the subsequent interview strategy for their chief medical officer. "I was not aware of the full Senator David Holt," Minjay said, and he said it quietly, almost gently, which was worse than if he'd said it like an accusation. 2023. "You know what I'm referring to." She did. She knew exactly what he was referring to, and she had known that it would surface eventually, because these things always did. Because she had built an entire career on the understanding that buried things did not stay buried, they only waited. And yet she had taken the Holt case because the money was extraordinary, and because she had been in the middle of a marriage that was rotting from the inside, and she had needed to feel effective somewhere, needed to feel like she was winning something, and she had done things she could not fully defend and had never tried to because the only defense available to her was the truth. And the truth was that she had known, and she had done it anyway. "What do you want from me?" she said. Minjay sat back. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not cruelty. She was clear on this. It was not cruelty. But something more complicated, a kind of recognition. "I want exactly what I said," he said. "Crisis management. I want you to work on rehabilitating the public-facing image of Junhua Capital's legitimate holdings, real estate, a hospitality group, 2 manufacturing companies. I want you to build a communication strategy that makes the journalist narratives harder to sustain. I want you to be present, available, and effective, starting next week." "And if I decline?" He said nothing. "If I decline," she said again, because she needed to hear the sentence completed, "then the information I have about Renner, Alston, and Senator Holt goes to people who will find it as interesting as I did." He said it without heat, without pleasure. "I don't want that outcome. It's not why I'm here. But I want you to understand the full shape of the situation." The full shape of the situation. She almost laughed. The full shape of the situation was that she had kissed a stranger on a dare, and he had turned out to be a man who bought leverage the way other men bought furniture. and that she had spent years making powerful people's messes disappear and had accumulated her own in the process. And that the most infuriating thing about the moment she was currently in was that she understood it. She understood his logic. She understood the mechanism. She had used versions of this same mechanism herself. "You could have just offered me a job," she said. "You would have said no." "You don't know that." "Miss Bennett." He stood. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was the absence of a nightclub, the absence of dim light and music, and the buffer of a dare. "You built this company from nothing after a divorce from a man who I suspect believed he was doing you a favor by tolerating your ambition. You take on clients other firms won't touch because the difficulty is what you're good at, and you know it. You are not someone who accepts offers from strangers for the sake of reasonable compensation." He adjusted the cuff of his jacket with a precision that was not vanity, but habit. "You needed the information. Now you have it." He walked to the door, paused. "Monday," he said. 9 o'clock. I'll send the address." He left. The lawyers followed. The woman with the tablet followed. The two men who were not lawyers exchanged a glance that communicated something she wasn't supposed to see and left without looking at her. Marcus was still by the window. The silence between them was the kind that had furniture in it, specific, heavy objects that would need to be moved before they could talk normally again, and neither of them was ready for that. 840,000, she said finally. "I know." 3 years, Marcus. "I know." His voice was rough. "I kept thinking, the next one, you know how it is. You keep thinking the next one is the one that—" "I don't know how it is," she said. "I don't—" She stopped. She pressed the heels of her hands against the desk. "I'm not angry about the money. I mean, I am, but that's not— You let someone else find it, Marcus. You let a man I kissed on a dare find it before you told me." He looked up at that. She could see him registering the full absurdity of the sentence the way it landed. "You kissed him," Marcus said. "That is not the important part of what I just said." "Amara." "I know." She stood and walked to the window. Stood next to him, both of them looking out at Wilshire Boulevard in the flat morning light. "What are you going to do?" Marcus said. "I don't know yet," she said. "He could destroy you." "He could try." "That's not reassurance." She looked at the street below. A bus. A woman pushing a stroller. A man in a delivery uniform jogging back to his truck. All of them entirely indifferent to the particular catastrophe unfolding 12 floors above them, which was, she thought, both completely reasonable and faintly insulting. "He's right about one thing," she said. "Which thing?" Marcus said carefully, as if there might be several he needed to rank. "The journalists. If someone is building a case against his operations, they're going to hit the legitimate businesses first. That's how these things work. You go for what you can document, what you can verify, what juries understand. Real estate, hospitality, manufacturing. Those are the entry points." She turned from the window. "If I were doing that story, that's where I'd start." "You're not seriously considering this." "I'm considering the problem," she said. "That's different." She was at her desk by the time she said, "Go home, Marcus, take the day. We'll figure out the partnership situation next week. There are attorneys to involve and it's going to be ugly, and I'm not ready to think about it until I've slept." He didn't argue. He knew her well enough. After he left, she sat alone in her office for 23 minutes, not looking at anything in particular, running the calculation she already knew the outcome of. She could fight it. There were lawyers, there were angles, there were ways to attack the transfer on procedural grounds. But he had clearly done it correctly. He'd done everything correctly. She had the sense this was a man who did not make sloppy legal errors, and fighting would take time and money she didn't currently have a surplus of. And while she fought, the information he held about Renner and Alston and David Holt would be sitting somewhere, waiting, and she would never entirely stop thinking about it. Or she could do the job. The job was technically not far from what she did every day. Crisis management for legitimate businesses. Image rehabilitation. Narrative construction. She had done it for people who deserved it less than she currently understood Kong Min Jae's companies to deserve it, which was a sentence she had not expected to be able to construct honestly about a mafia boss. And yet here it was. She was not naive about what she was considering. She knew what his organization was. She had not lived in Los Angeles for 15 years without understanding what the Hanwoo Syndicate meant, what it controlled, what it cost the city and the people in it. She was not telling herself a story in which this was clean or simple or entirely defensible, but she had stopped telling herself clean stories somewhere around year 3 of her marriage, and she had gotten very efficient at surviving in the space between what she wanted to be true and what actually was. She picked up her phone, opened the contact file she'd had her assistant pull together in the 40 minutes since the lawyers left. Junhua Capital Group, 3 subsidiaries, 16 properties across California, Nevada, and Washington state. A hospitality group with 4 hotels and 2 restaurant brands. A mid-sized precision manufacturing operation in Torrance with a government contracting component that immediately told her 3 things about why the journalists were circling. She set the phone down. She thought about what he'd said. You are not someone who accepts offers from strangers for the sake of reasonable compensation. She hated that he was right. She hated the specific quality of being seen accurately by someone she had no context for, no history with, no prior claim on. It felt like standing in a room with one wall missing. Monday came faster than she intended. She was at the address he'd sent by 8:55, which was a building in Century City that from the outside looked like any of the 20 buildings in a 2-block radius, glass, steel, a lobby with a security desk and 2 elevators. The difference was the man at the security desk who had her name before she gave it, and the elevator that required a card she had been handed in an envelope slid under her office door Friday morning with no note attached. The 32nd floor opened directly into a space that was not what she had expected. She had expected something performative, dark wood, the visual vocabulary of power, the aesthetic of intimidation. Instead, it was open, functional, and slightly sparse. The kind of space that said, work happens here, and work is the point. There were 4 people at desks who did not look up when she arrived, and a conference room with a glass wall through which she could see a man on the phone who was not Min Jae. Min Jae was standing at the windows, looking at the city, and he turned when she stepped off the elevator with the timing of someone who had heard the elevator from 2 rooms away. You came, he said. I told you I would. He said nothing to that, just looked at her for a moment, and she had the impression of something being confirmed rather than discovered. He walked her to the conference room. The man on the phone ended his call and introduced himself as Yoon Ji-hoon, head of legal and compliance, which told her immediately that Min Jae had structured this meeting to include witness and record, which she respected as professionalism, even if she found it mildly aggressive. She had brought her own notes. She spread them on the table without asking, because waiting to be invited was not a habit she intended to acquire. The manufacturing subsidiary in Torrance, she said. That's where this starts. The government contracting work gives the journalists a thread. Federal contracts mean federal disclosure requirements, which means records, which means a paper trail that any competent reporter can follow back as far as they want to go. She looked at Min Jae. Has anyone done a full audit of the contracting documentation in the last 18 months? No, Ji-hoon said. You need to, before anyone else does. She made a note. The hospitality group is lower risk, but not no risk. The 2 restaurant brands both have locations in neighborhoods with active community tension around gentrification. If a reporter is looking for a narrative about your organization moving into communities and extracting value, we employ 412 people across those locations, Min Jae said. 80% of them live within 3 miles of the restaurants. She looked at him. That's exactly the kind of information that should be public and isn't. That's a story you're not telling. I don't tell stories, he said. You do now, she said. That's why I'm here. The meeting lasted 3 hours. She did not learn everything she needed to in those 3 hours, but she learned enough to understand the shape of what she was being asked to do. And the shape was, strictly speaking, not illegal. The businesses were real. The employees were real. The compliance issues she'd identified were manageable if addressed quickly and honestly, which was a word she used carefully and watched Min Jae absorb without flinching. At the 2.5-hour mark, Ji-hoon stepped out to take a call, and she and Min Jae were alone in the conference room for the first time. The quality of the silence changed. She kept her eyes on her notes. The Torrance location is going to be the hard one, she said. The contracting relationships need to be re-examined, and some of them may need to be, "Why did you actually come?" he said. She looked up. He was watching her with that quality she remembered, the one that looked at the underneath of things. "I came because you left me limited alternatives," she said. "You had alternatives. You're smart enough to have found them." He held her gaze. lawyers, regulatory complaints about the transfer, going to the journalist yourself before I could. There were moves available to you. They would have taken time I don't have and exposed things I'm not ready to expose. That's one reason, he said. What's the other one? She set her pen down. The problem you have is real, she said carefully. And it's the kind of problem I know how to solve. Not, she stopped herself, chose the next word deliberately. Not for your sake, because the work is something I can actually do. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to try to find the clean version of this. There is no clean version. No. He almost smiled again. The same almost. But you're going to try anyway. She looked at him. Is that a problem? No, he said. It's why you're here. Ji-hoon came back. The meeting concluded. She gathered her notes. He walked her to the elevator. At the elevator door, she turned. I need full access to the compliance documentation for all 3 subsidiaries. I need the names of the journalists currently on the story. And I need your legal team to stop stonewalling the manufacturing union's request for a safety review, because that is the specific detail that is going to become a front-page story if it isn't addressed in the next 30 days. He regarded her. Agreed, he said. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. Miss Bennett. She looked back. The kiss, he said. Not like a threat, not like a joke. Simply a statement, offered without context, as if naming a point on a map. You said you didn't think it through. I didn't. I know. He held the elevator door with one hand. Neither did I. He let the door close. She rode down 30 floors in the kind of silence that had a frequency to it, and walked out onto the street into the Los Angeles afternoon, and stood for a moment on the sidewalk trying to reorganize herself into a version that understood what had just happened. The problem was the way he said it. Neither did I. Not I let it go, or it doesn't matter, or any version of a sentence that closed a door. He had said it like someone naming a fact they had not previously acknowledged aloud, which was the most dangerous kind of sentence, the honest one. She took the 405 back to the office and spent the rest of the afternoon building the initial framework for a communication strategy. She was not entirely sure was right, and did not have the luxury of being uncertain about. By Thursday of that week, she had the compliance documents. By Friday, she had the 2 journalists' names and had done enough background on them to understand that one was a Pulitzer finalist who wrote long-form investigations with a patience she genuinely admired, and the other was younger and faster and more interested in breaking things than understanding them, which made the second one, paradoxically, easier to manage. She worked late. She worked the weekend. She stopped dreaming about Daniel and started dreaming about document structures, which she told herself was an improvement. Min-jae called on Saturday. Not texted. Called. She was at her kitchen counter with 3 folders spread around a cold cup of coffee. She looked at the number. It was the first time he'd called directly, all previous communication having been through Ji-hoon, and answered. I have the manufacturing audit results, he said without preamble. It's Saturday. I know what day it is. A pause. There are 3 compliance gaps that are going to need to be disclosed proactively, if you want them. I want them, she said, and reached for her pen. He read the information. She wrote it down. They were on the phone for 11 minutes, and for 11 minutes they were purely professional, and she was aware of how deliberate that was on both sides, the way they were both working to keep the space between them functional and clear. At the end of the 11 minutes, he said, There's a gala on the 14th, the Meridian Foundation benefit. I've been asked to attend as part of the image building. Ji-hoon thinks it's valuable. It will require me to be visible and social and everything I am bad at. Okay, she said. I need you there. She said nothing for a moment. As a professional, he said. As the person managing the communications. It's a public event with press coverage. Your presence would be appropriate. I understand, she said. Will you come? She looked at the folders. She looked at the cold coffee. She thought about a man holding an elevator door and saying, Neither did I, as though he'd surprised himself with his own honesty. Yes, she said. She hung up before she could overthink it. She did not overthink it. She overthought it anyway. By Sunday evening, she had built the full communication framework and sent it to Ji-hoon with a cover note that was purely procedural. By Monday morning, it had been approved with 2 modifications she found reasonable. By Tuesday, the union safety review was scheduled, which produced a visible and immediate relaxation in the language of the younger journalist's Twitter feed that told her the narrative had not yet calcified into something unmovable. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The problem was that being good at it required her to care about the outcome, and she had not expected to care, and the caring was coming from a direction she hadn't prepared a defense for. She was in the elevator of her building Wednesday evening when her phone rang. Not Minjay this time. A number she didn't immediately recognize. She answered anyway. The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that specific frequencies of sound are familiar. You don't always remember what the sound belongs to until you're already in it. Amara, the voice said. Daniel. She stood in the elevator as the doors opened on her floor. She did not step out. How did you get this number? She said, which was not the right question but was the one that came out. I've always had this number, he said. You didn't change it. She hadn't. She hadn't thought she needed to. What do you want, Daniel? I heard you've been spending time with someone, he said. His voice was careful and measured, the voice he used when he was gathering information while trying to appear to not be gathering information. A voice she had once found reassuring because it sounded like calm and now understood as something much colder. Someone significant. The elevator doors tried to close. She put her hand out. They opened again. That's not your business, she said. Amara. He sighed in the way that suggested the person sighing was exhibiting great patience in the face of someone else's stubbornness. You need to be careful. The man you're involved with professionally, I'm not involved, is under active federal investigation, he said. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see you hurt. She stood in the elevator with the doors held open and thought about several things at once, with the specific efficiency of a brain that had learned to run multiple processes simultaneously because single-threaded thinking was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. She thought about the fact that Daniel was a federal investigator. She thought about the fact that he was calling her about Minjay within 2 weeks of her starting to work with Minjay. She thought about the fact that he'd said, I've always had this number, which was not the statement of a man who had let her go. She thought about how the younger journalist's Twitter feed had relaxed, and how quickly, and how that required someone paying close enough attention to track the shift. She stepped out of the elevator. The doors closed behind her. Daniel, she said, don't call this number again. She hung up. She stood in the hallway outside her apartment and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives not like lightning, but like a light being switched on in a room you've been sitting in for a while, that this had never been about a dare. It had been about something that started the moment she stepped into Knox, or maybe before that, maybe in the years she'd spent cleaning up other people's catastrophes while quietly building her own. And now all of it was moving, all of it was in motion, and the man she'd thought she was done with, and the man she'd thought was a mistake, and every buried thing she had ever helped someone hide were converging on the same point. She unlocked her apartment. She sat down in the dark. She thought about the gala on the 14th. She thought about what it meant that Daniel knew about Minjay. And then she thought about something Minjay had said in that first meeting, delivered without drama, without emphasis, as if it were simply information. I don't want that outcome, but I want you to understand the full shape of the situation. She had thought he was talking about the leverage he held over her. She was beginning to understand he might have been talking about something much larger, something that included her ex-husband and a federal investigation and a gala that was 9 days away, and she had walked into all of it thinking she was managing the situation, when the situation had been managing her for considerably longer than she knew. She sat in the dark for a long time, not thinking, or rather, thinking in the way that happens when the brain has received too much information too quickly and needs to sort it into categories before it can build an argument, the way water finds its level before it starts to move. Daniel knew about Minjay. That was the sentence she kept returning to, the one that wouldn't organize itself neatly alongside the others. Not because it was impossible. Daniel was a federal investigator. He had access to information that most people didn't. It was conceivable that Minjay's name had crossed his desk through entirely legitimate channels. All of that was conceivable. What was not conceivable was the timing. She had been working with Minjay for 11 days. 11 days during which she had not spoken to Daniel once, had not posted anything on social media, had not mentioned the work to anyone outside the office. The only people who knew were Marcus, Jihoon, and the 4 people at desks on the 30th floor who hadn't looked up when she arrived. Daniel did not call with information he had stumbled across. Daniel called with information he had been looking for. She got up from the chair at 11:15. She made herself eat something, toast, because it was what was available, and because her stomach had closed down for the evening, and toast was negotiable in a way that other foods weren't. She stood at the counter and ate it and thought about the specific quality of Daniel's voice. I'm telling you this because I don't want to see you hurt. The patience of it. The deliberate, organized patience of a man who had already decided what he wanted from the conversation and was simply navigating toward it. She had heard that voice for 6 years. She had called it calm. She went to bed. She slept 3 hours. She was at her desk by 6. By 7:30, she had run everything she could legally access on Daniel's current caseload, which was not much. Federal investigators did not publish their working files, but enough to tell her that his office had been involved in 2 organized crime prosecutions in the last 18 months, both of them connected to West Coast syndicate operations. Neither of them publicly linked to the Hanwoo syndicate by name. Neither of them. But the structural patterns of the prosecutions, the specific financial instruments targeted, the timing of the asset freezes. She had spent 6 years learning how to read the underneath of things, and the underneath of Daniel's last 2 cases pointed in a direction she needed to not be right about. She called Ji-hoon at 8. I need a meeting, she said. Today. With Mr. Kang. He has... Today, Ji-hoon. A pause. Noon, he said. The Century City office. Fine. She spent the intervening hours building the communication framework for the gala, which was in 6 days, and doing it with the specific focused energy of someone who needs their hands occupied while their mind works on a separate problem. The gala was the Meridian Foundation benefit, black tie, 400 guests, significant press presence. She had arranged for 3 strategic interviews, coordinated 2 pre-event profiles with outlets whose readership skewed toward the business community rather than the crime beat, and drafted talking points for Min-jae that she had marked as requires review and significant revision because you will hate all of these and argue with me about them. At 11:40, she was in the elevator to the 30th floor. Min-jae was already in the conference room. No Ji-hoon this time. Just him, at the head of the table, with a cup of coffee he had not touched, and a stillness that told her he had been told enough about the purpose of the meeting to arrive already thinking. She sat down. She did not spread her notes. She put her hands flat on the table. My ex-husband called me last night, she said. His expression did not change. Daniel Carter, she said. He's a federal investigator. He told me you're under active federal investigation and said he was calling because he didn't want to see me hurt. Silence. Is that true? She said. The investigation. There's always an investigation, Min-jae said. My organization has been under some form of federal attention for 4 years. It's the nature of what we are. He held her gaze. The specific shape of the current one is something I've been managing through counsel for the last 8 months. It's part of why I needed you. You didn't tell me there was an active federal case. I told you there were journalists. I told you there was regulatory pressure. A federal investigation is a related but distinct... Don't, she said. Flat. No heat in it. Just wait. Don't do the thing where you parse the language into acceptable increments. I'm not Ji-hoon. I'm not going to be satisfied with technically accurate. He stopped. How long? She said. 8 months, as I said. How serious? He looked at her for a long moment. Then, with the quality of someone making a decision they have already made and are simply now executing. Serious enough that if the wrong information reaches the wrong people at the wrong moment, it becomes something I can't manage through legal channels alone. What information? Financial records, he said, from 2019 through 2021. A period during which certain transactions were structured in ways that were not illegal in themselves, but interpretable. Interpretable, she said, in the worst possible way if the person interpreting them has already decided what they want to find. She sat with that. And Daniel Carter, she said, is he the person doing the interpreting? His name has come up in connection with the investigation, Min-jae said, and the care with which he said it told her it had come up more than once and in more than one context. He is not the lead on the case, but he is connected to it. How connected? That's what I'm trying to determine. She looked at him. You knew he was my ex-husband. Yes. Before you approached my company. He did not look away. Yes. The room was very quiet. She could hear the building's ventilation system, a low and constant sound she had stopped noticing until just now. Was that a factor? She said. In choosing me? It was information I had, he said. I don't make decisions without full information. That's not an answer. No, he said. It wasn't a factor in choosing you. Your work was the factor. Carter's connection to you was something I noted, something I thought might become relevant. It has become relevant. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window because she needed to put distance between herself and the table, between herself and the specific quality of his honesty, which was the kind that gave you everything you needed to be furious and nothing you could cleanly call a lie. He called me, she said. He called me and told me to be careful. That's not what people do when they're running an investigation. You don't call the subject's associate and tip them off unless you want something from the associate. What do you think he wants? I think he wants me to pull back, she said. I think he wants me frightened and compliant and away from whatever he's building. She turned from the window. I think Daniel has been watching your operation for longer than 8 months, and I think my working with you was not a surprise to him. I think it was something he calculated for, or something he arranged for. Min-jae's expression shifted, barely, but she caught it. You already thought this, she said. I thought it was possible, he said. How possible? Possible enough, he said, that I have people looking at the timeline of how Marcus's debt became known to certain creditors, the specific creditors whose debt I acquired. She stared at him. You think Daniel surfaced Marcus's debt, she said. You think he made sure it reached you, so that you'd move on my company, so that I'd end up here. I think it's worth examining, Min-jae said. She pressed both hands against the glass of the window and looked at the city below with the particular sensation of the floor reorganizing itself under her. Not falling, not panic, but the sickening shift of realizing the map you've been using is wrong, has been wrong, and every direction you've traveled using it has been someone else's choice and not your own. Why? She said. Why would he want me here? Because you know things, Min-jae said. He stood. He moved to stand beside her at the window, not close, but closer than the table. You spent 6 years managing communications for powerful people who did not want their activities examined. Some of those people are connected to networks my organization intersects with. If Carter is building a case and he needs someone who knows the internal architecture of how those networks communicate and cover themselves, he'd want someone on the inside, she said. Someone who doesn't look like an informant, Min-jae said. Someone who looks like a woman rebuilding her life after a divorce. She turned her head and looked at him directly. You think he set me up to be his source? I think it's possible that your presence here was not accidental. But I chose to come here. He didn't make me take the dare. He didn't make me walk across that room. No, Min-jae said. But he may have made sure you were in the room. He may have made sure Marcus's debt became visible at precisely the right moment. He may have made sure the circumstances existed in which you had few alternatives. She looked back at the city. A plane was crossing the sky, very high, a white scratch against blue. She thought about the night of the dare. Jasmine had gotten them into Knox through a client connection, Jasmine's client. A client Amara had never been introduced to, had never asked about. She thought about Daniel, who had been careful and measured and organized for 6 years, who had let her build her company and her independence and her life on the foundation of a marriage that was rotting, who had tolerated her ambition the way someone tolerates a long game. Patiently, because they know the end. She thought about what Min-jae had said the first morning. You have no idea what you just started. I need to make a call, she said. Who to? Jasmine, she said. I need to know the name of the client who got us into Knox. She made the call in the hallway. Jasmine answered on the second ring, which meant she was between meetings. Amara kept the question short and direct. Client name, Knox connection, how it came through. There was a pause that lasted 4 seconds, which on Jasmine was the equivalent of a longer person's 10. Why? Jasmine said. Just tell me. Another pause, then. It came through a referral. A colleague of mine was approached about, Amara, what is this about? The name, Jasmine. The referral came from a man named Peterson. He's connected to the DA's office. I didn't ask questions because it was just a night out, and the venue was connected to the DA's office, Amara said. Not federal. No, but he works alongside. They collaborate on task force things. I've seen him in federal buildings. Amara, you're scaring me. I'm fine, she said. Don't say anything to anyone about this call. She hung up. She stood in the hallway with her back against the wall and breathed, slowly, through the specific coldness of confirmed suspicion. It was worse than uncertainty. Uncertainty had movement in it, possibility. Confirmation was a closed room. Daniel had arranged the night. He had arranged the venue, the access, the specific circumstances in which she was celebrating her freedom from a marriage he had controlled, and he had put her in a room with Kang Min-jae and relied on her being exactly who she was, capable, reckless in her specific way, too proud to refuse a dare that her friends were watching. He had known she would walk across the room. He had constructed a situation in which she would want to. She went back into the conference room. Min-jae looked at her face and said nothing, just waited, with the patience of someone who has learned to let information arrive without rushing it. He arranged it, she said. The night at the club. The referral that got us in came from someone connected to his office. Min-jae was still. He knew you'd be there, she said. He knew I'd be there. He arranged them to happen at the same time, and he relied on... She stopped. He knows me. He knew what I would do. He used you, Min-jae said. He used both of us. She sat down. He wanted me inside your organization. He wanted a source who looked clean, who had a legitimate professional reason to be there, who had access to your communication strategy and your compliance documentation and your... She pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, took it away. Everything I've filed with Jihoon, every document, every strategy note. Has it left your office? Min-jae said. His voice was very quiet. No, she said. I work on a closed system. Nothing transfers without my physical authorization. She met his eyes. I didn't know I was a source. I want to be clear about that. I know, he said. You can't just... Amara. Her first name. The first time. It landed in the conversation with a weight that neither of them commented on. I know you didn't know. The gala was in 6 days. She thought about this. She thought about the press access she'd arranged, the interviews, the public visibility she'd constructed specifically to be documentable, legible, a record of rehabilitation and legitimate enterprise. Everything she'd built for him was also, from a different angle, everything she'd built for Daniel. A clear, clean, comprehensive picture of Min-jae's organization that no investigator had been able to construct from the outside. She had done the work herself. She had done it thoroughly. She stood up again. She needed to stand. We have to get ahead of this. How? I need to know everything, she said. Not the sanitized version, not the legally manageable version. Everything. Every vulnerability in the organization, every financial relationship that could be interpreted in the wrong direction, every person who has access to sensitive information and might have a reason to cooperate with a federal investigation. She looked at him. Because if Daniel is using me as a source, then he's also protecting me. As long as I'm useful. The moment I'm not useful, I become expendable. And I don't intend to be expendable. He looked at her for a long time. The quality of it was different from the other times. Not measuring exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that recognized something. The gala, he said. We still do the gala, she said. We change nothing about the external plan. We give him nothing to react to. And internally. Internally, she said. I need 48 hours with your full compliance and legal documentation. I need to find what he's looking for before he finds it. And I need to understand who inside your organization has been communicating with anyone outside it. She watched him take this in. That's a significant ask, he said. I know what I'm asking. Some of that information could itself be, I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He was quiet for a moment, then, there's something else. The way he said it made her go still. There's something else, she said. He sat down. This was new. He rarely sat when there was something difficult to say. She had already learned this about him. He stood or moved or held the stillness near windows. Sitting meant something he did not want to say. I have someone in my organization, he said slowly, who has been behaving unusually for approximately the last 6 weeks. Small things. Pattern changes. A man who has always been careful becoming slightly less careful in ways that suggest he is distracted or is carrying something he didn't previously have to carry. Who? She said. He looked at the table. My brother, he said. Kang Seong-ho. He is the head of internal operations. She let that settle. You think your brother is talking to someone, she said. I think my brother is doing something he hasn't told me about, Min-jae said. Whether that is talking to someone or protecting someone or simply making decisions he doesn't think I'd approve of, I don't know yet. Does he know about me? About what I'm doing here? Yes. He was present when I made the decision to approach your company. Min-jae stopped, started again. He disagreed with the decision. He thought bringing in an outside consultant with connections to a federal investigator, she said. Yes. He met her eyes. He thought it was a vulnerability. He wasn't wrong, she said. No, Min-jae said. He was right about the vulnerability. He may have been wrong about what to do about it. She looked at him. Or he decided to do something about it himself. The silence that followed was the kind that has an answer in it that neither person is ready to say yet. She left the Century City office at 2:15. She drove because she needed the physical action of driving, the small decisions of lane changes and lights, and the ordinary mechanical engagement of it. She took surface streets instead of the freeway because surface streets required more attention, and she wanted every part of her brain occupied. She thought about Daniel. She thought about 6 years of a marriage she had read as complicated but functional, two people who had grown in different directions but were both trying, a love that had curdled slowly rather than broken cleanly. She had blamed herself for a significant portion of it. She had believed, in the specific way that people believe things they need to be true, that the failure of the marriage was a shared failure, mutual and human. She was revising that assessment. She was revising it with the cold, careful precision of someone who has built a career on understanding how stories are constructed and is now applying that skill to the story she had been living in, and the revision was not gentle. She had been useful to him. She had been, for 6 years, an extremely well-positioned tool. Her access to powerful people, her knowledge of how communications networks operated between corporate and political, and, now she understood, criminal entities. He had married adjacent to her skills the way someone invests in infrastructure, and when the marriage ended, he had not let her go. He had repositioned her. She was on Wilshire Boulevard when her phone rang through the car's speakers. Ji-hoon. Ms. Bennett, he said, and there was something in his voice that she identified instantly, the particular compression of someone communicating under a constraint. Mr. Kong has asked me to tell you that the arrangements for Friday have been updated. There's a preparatory meeting scheduled for Thursday evening at the Meridian Foundation venue, a walkthrough. That wasn't in the original plan, she said. No, Ji-hoon said. There have been some security updates that require a site review. What kind of security updates? A pause. I think it would be better discussed in person. She pulled over. Ji-hoon, what happened? Another pause. Longer. Then, there was an incident at the Torrance facility this morning. A man was found on the property who should not have been there. He was carrying recording equipment and a camera. He was detained and handed to appropriate authorities, but he had a press credential, she said. He had a federal observer credential, Ji-hoon said. She sat with the engine running and the phone connected and the particular sound of Los Angeles traffic moving indifferently past her window. Send me everything, she said. The credential number, the agency designation, everything you documented before you handed him over. Ms. Bennett, Ji-hoon. She kept her voice completely even. Send me everything. She drove the rest of the way to her office. She spent 4 hours running the credential, which was legitimate, federal, observer status, connected to a task force she could not access directly, but whose organizational structure she could map from public records. The task force had been formed 14 months ago. Its stated purpose was financial crimes. Investigation. Targeting West Coast organized criminal enterprise. Daniel was not listed in the public-facing documentation. He didn't need to be. She went home at 8. She ate actual food this time, mechanically, standing at the counter again because sitting felt like a decision she hadn't earned. She called Priya because she needed to hear a voice that was not connected to any of this, and they talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and she listened to Priya's voice the way you hold something warm when the temperature outside is wrong. After she hung up, she sat down and built a timeline. She built it the way she built timelines for clients, starting with what was certain and working outward to what was probable, and then to what was possible. She used paper because paper was slower, and slowness made her more careful. What was certain, Daniel had arranged her presence at Knox. Daniel was connected to the federal investigation of Min Jae's organization. Daniel had called her within 11 days of her starting work with Min Jae. A federal observer had appeared at the Torrance facility. What was probable, Daniel had used Marcus's debt as a mechanism to insert her into the organization. He had expected her to function as an unwitting source. He was now uncertain whether she had figured this out, which was why he had called, not to warn her but to take her temperature. What was possible? Daniel had someone else inside the organization already. The federal credential at Torrance was not phishing. It was confirmation of something they already knew or almost knew. They were close to something. And Seung-ho. She wrote his name on the paper and sat looking at it. Min Jae's brother, who had disagreed with the decision to bring her in, who had been carrying something for 6 weeks that had made him less careful. 6 weeks ago was approximately the same time the Torrance Observer credential had been issued. She stared at the name. She thought about the way Min Jae had said he was right about the vulnerability with the exhaustion of someone who has accepted an uncomfortable truth. She thought about what it would mean if Seung-ho had not gone to Daniel with information about Min Jae's organization. What if he had gone to Daniel with information about her? What if the thing Seung-ho had decided to do about the vulnerability she represented was to contact the federal investigation and tell them exactly what Daniel already knew, that she was there, that she was inside, and that she could be used? What if Seung-ho and Daniel were not on opposite sides of this? She set the pen down. She looked at the timeline. The gala was in 5 days, 400 people, significant press presence. 3 strategic interviews she had arranged. A public venue with sightlines she had not personally reviewed because she had been focused on the communication strategy and not the physical security, because physical security was not her job, because she had not understood until approximately 6 hours ago that physical security was relevant. She picked up the phone, dialed Min Jae. He answered on the second ring. She could hear ambient sound he was still at the office, or somewhere not home. Thursday's walkthrough, she said without preamble. I need it moved to tomorrow. A pause. Why? Because I think we're running out of time, she said, and because I think the threat at the gala may not be external. She heard him go still. The ambient sound around him seemed to quiet. Explain, he said. Not on the phone, she said. Tomorrow. Early. 7, he said. 7, she agreed. She hung up and looked at the timeline on the paper in front of her, all of it pointing at the same point, all of it converging on a room she hadn't chosen to walk into, or had chosen, but only because someone who understood her better than she'd known had built the circumstances and opened the door and let her believe the choice was hers. She thought about Min Jae saying neither did I. She thought about whether that was true. She thought about whether it mattered. She folded the timeline and put it in her jacket pocket and turned off the lights, and stood for a moment in the dark of her own apartment, listening to the building settle, listening to the street below, listening to the particular sound of a life that had been running on assumptions that were no longer intact. She was not afraid. She was something colder than afraid. The specific temperature of someone who has finally seen the full shape of the room they're standing in and understands that the only way forward is through it, and that through it means becoming someone capable of surviving what's in the middle, and that the person she'd been before she walked into Knox was not entirely that person, and the person she would need to be by the end of the gala was someone she had not yet fully. She was at the Century City building at 6:53. The lobby guard had her name before she reached the desk. The elevator card worked. She rode up 30 floors in the particular silence of a building that has not yet filled with the day's human noise, just the mechanical hum of systems running without witness. And she used the 30 seconds to breathe in a specific way her father had taught her when she was 12 years old. Slow in, hold, slow out, not for calm, but for clarity, for the separation of what she felt from what she needed to do. Her father had been Army, 2 tours. He had not talked about the tours much, but he had talked constantly about the discipline of the body as a tool, about how the body would betray you in the exact moment you needed it most unless you had taught it, repeatedly and deliberately, that you were in charge of it and not the other way around. She had thought, for most of her adult life, that this was interesting history, something that explained the man without particularly applying to her. She was revising that assessment too. Min Jae was already in the conference room, so was a man she had not seen before, mid-40s, compact, with the specific quality of attention that she identified within 4 seconds as someone whose professional life required the assessment of physical threats. He was introduced as Park Sung-jae, head of security operations. There was no Ji-hoon. She noted the absence. She sat down. "Tell me what you told me on the phone," Min-jae said. She laid it out. She did not soften it or sequence it for comfort. She gave it in the order of certainty, the way she'd built the timeline, starting with what was documented and moving outward. Daniel's call. The Knox arrangement. The federal credential at Torrance. The timeline of Seong-ho's behavioral changes against the timeline of the observer credential's issuance. She watched Min-jae's face while she talked. It was the face of someone receiving information that is simultaneously new and not new. The face of someone whose suspicion is being confirmed, which is not relief, which is its own specific kind of pain. When she finished, Park Sung-jae spoke first. "The credential at Torrance," he said, "the agency designation. Can you identify the task force?" She slid the paper across the table. He looked at it. Something moved through his expression that he controlled immediately. "You recognize it," she said. "I recognize the structure," he said. "It's the same framework that was used in the 2021 Cho prosecution. Different task force, same organizational design, which means the same office authorized it." "Daniel Carter's office," she said. Sung-jae looked at Min-jae. Min-jae looked at the table for a moment, then back at her. "Seong-ho," she said. "I need to ask you something directly." "Ask." "When did he first express concern about my involvement with the organization?" Min-jae was quiet for a moment. "The night I told him. He called it reckless. He said bringing in an outsider with personal connections to a federal investigator was the kind of mistake that ended operations." "How did he know about Daniel?" she said. "At that point I had said nothing about my ex-husband. My connection to Daniel was not public information." The room was very quiet. "He knew," Min-jae said. "Not a question." "He knew before you told him," she said, "which means he either researched me before you made the decision, possible if he was concerned and due diligent, or he already had the information because someone had already given it to him." She held Min-jae's gaze. "Daniel would know to approach Seong-ho first. If he'd been building this for months, he'd have mapped your organization's internal structure. He'd know your brother is the second authority. He'd know that going to Seong-ho with concerns about your judgment, concerns about a woman you were developing a relationship with, would land differently than going to anyone else." Min-jae said nothing. "He may have gone to Seong-ho with the story that I was a plant," she said, "that Daniel himself had arranged me to get close to you, which is true, but the version Seong-ho was told may have positioned it as something I was doing willingly." "Making you the threat," Min-jae said. "And making Seong-ho the solution," she said. "A man who loves his brother and believes his brother is being manipulated by a woman who is secretly working for the federal government. That's not a traitor. That's someone trying to protect his family." The silence lasted a long time. Min-jae stood. He walked to the window. She watched his back, the set of his shoulders, the specific quality of stillness that was not stillness at all but compression. Everything pulled inward, everything held. "He's not a traitor," Min-jae said finally. "I don't think so either," she said. "I think he's been used the same way I've been used, just from a different direction." Sung-jae leaned forward. "The gala," he said. "Yes," she said. "If Carter has been building this and believes the gala is an opportunity, it's the best opportunity he'll have," she said. 400 people. Press coverage I arranged, which means he knows the layout, knows the access points, knows who will be in the room. I built the event visibility and he's been watching me build it." She looked at Min-jae's back. "He's not going to miss it." Min-jae turned from the window. His face had resolved into something, not calm, not anger, something that was past both of those, a quality of decision that lived on the far side of everything else. "What do you need?" he said. "I need to talk to Seong-ho," she said. Min-jae looked at her. "Before the gala," she said, "without you in the room. I need him to tell me what Carter told him, and he won't do it with you there because he'll spend the whole conversation managing what it does to you instead of telling me the truth." Min-jae did not like this. She could see that clearly. The discomfort of it was visible in the way he held his jaw, in the particular tension of a man who had built his entire life around not sending people he was responsible for into rooms without his protection. "He won't hurt me," she said. "He doesn't think I'm dangerous. He thinks I'm a tool." That's actually what I need him to keep thinking, at least for the length of the conversation. And after the conversation, Min-jae said. After the conversation, she said, we'll know what Carter actually has, and we can build something that uses it against him. The meeting ended at 9:15. Sung-jae left to coordinate the venue walkthrough. Min-jae and Amara were alone, and she was packing her notes, and he was standing by the window again with his jacket off, which was the most undone she had seen him, and there was something about the quality of the morning light on the scar on his left hand that made her think, inconveniently, about the first night, about 3 seconds, and the quality of his attention, and a man who had told her she had no idea what she'd started. Amara, he said. She looked up. If this goes wrong, I know, she said. I want to be clear about what that means. Carter is not a prosecutor. He's an investigator who has been running an unsanctioned strategy. Using a civilian as an unwitting source is not a legitimate federal operation, which means he's outside his authorization. That makes him unpredictable. Men who are outside their authorization don't have rules to follow. I know, she said again. You should be afraid, he said. I am, she said. That's different from not doing it. He looked at her for a long moment, then, your father taught you that. She stopped. What? The way you said it. The distinction between fear and action. That's taught. That's not natural. She looked at him. Army, she said. 2 tours. He used to say... She stopped. It was a strange moment to be saying her father's words. He used to say fear is just information. It tells you the stakes. It doesn't tell you what to do. Min-jae was quiet. Then, very quietly. My father said something similar. Different context. She did not ask about the context. She left the building at 9:30 and called Seong-ho's office line from the car. He answered himself, which told her he didn't have a gatekeeper on his direct line, which was useful information. This is Amara Bennett, she said. I need 20 minutes, today. A pause. Why? Because I know what Carter told you about me, she said. And I know it wasn't the whole truth. And I think you're smart enough to want the whole truth before the gala. A longer pause. She drove. She let the silence do its work. 2 o'clock, Seong-ho said. The Koreatown office. Not Century City. Fine, she said. The Koreatown office was above a dry cleaning business on a block that looked entirely ordinary, which she understood was the point. She was shown up a back staircase by a young man who didn't introduce himself and left her in a room with 2 chairs, a table, and a window with the blinds half down. Seong-ho arrived 4 minutes later. He was shorter than his brother, broader through the shoulders, with a face that shared Min-jae's angular structure but carried it differently. Where Min-jae's face was controlled, Seong-ho's was guarded, which was not the same thing. Control was active. Guardedness was defensive. It told her something about the 2 men's histories within the same family. He sat. He did not offer anything, not water, not a greeting, not the social scaffolding people use to make difficult conversations feel less like what they are. She respected it. Carter told you I was working for him, she said. Seong-ho's expression didn't change. He told me you had been placed. By him. That your divorce, your company's vulnerability, your presence at Knox, all of it had been arranged. He was right about that, she said. Seong-ho's eyes sharpened. He arranged it. He did not tell me he arranged it. I was not willing. I did not know. She held his gaze. I found out 4 days ago. Seong-ho looked at her with the quality of assessment she recognized from his brother, the same genetic habit of looking at the underneath of things. Carter told me you would say that. Of course he did, she said. It's the obvious defense, which is exactly why it's also the truth. If I were lying, I'd have come up with something harder to dismiss. A pause. The sound of a bus passing outside. Seong-ho's hands were flat on the table, very still, the stillness of someone who is listening with their whole body. What do you want from this conversation? He said. I want to know what he asked you to do, she said. Seong-ho said nothing. At the gala, she said. Whatever he's built, the gala is his moment. He needs something from your side to happen at the gala. Something that looks like internal action, not federal operation, so that his role stays invisible. She watched Seong-ho's jaw tighten by a degree. He needs Min Jae exposed at the gala without a federal hand visible in the exposure, which means he needs someone inside to create the moment. You don't know what you're talking about, Sung-ho said. Then tell me I'm wrong, she said. Specifically, tell me which part of it is wrong. He looked at her, his hands still flat on the table, pressed down slightly, the subtle and involuntary tell of someone holding themselves against an impulse. He said Min Jae would be arrested, Sung-ho said finally. Low, the voice of a man making a decision he cannot unmake. He said the evidence was sufficient regardless. He said if I cooperated, the organization would survive, that the legitimate businesses would be protected, the people employed by them would be protected. He said Min Jae would face reduced charges. He stopped. He said it was the only way to protect your brother, she said. Sung-ho's expression did something complicated and painful that he controlled quickly but not quickly enough. What did he ask you to do? She said. Quiet, not accusatory, as close to gentle as the situation allowed. There's a communications room at the gala venue, Sung-ho said. The foundation's AV setup. During the event, a data package was to be introduced into the venue's network. Documentation. Financial records from 2019 through 2021. Records that would be immediately accessible to any journalist with the right credentials already present in the room. He'd have journalists there, she said, credentialed through the press access I arranged. Yes, and the records. Structured to be interpretable, Sung-ho said, and she heard the word echo from Min Jae's voice 3 days ago. The same word, the family vocabulary for the same impossible thing. In the worst possible way, she said. Yes. She sat with this for a moment. 400 people, the press access she had built, the strategic interviews she had set up with outlets whose credibility she had specifically selected. She had built the stage. Daniel had planned to use it to burn everything on it. He told you it was the only way, she said. He told me the alternative was Min Jae facing charges that would end everything, Sung-ho said. All of it. The legitimate businesses, the employees, He stopped again. His voice had gone rough. My brother has been trying to build something real for the past 3 years. Something that could survive past both of us. Carter told me he would take that regardless, and I could either protect what I could or lose everything. He lied to you, she said. You would say that. He lied to you because an uncontrolled exposure at a public gala leaked through a venue network to planted journalists is not a prosecution, she said. It's a spectacle. It's designed to destroy reputation, not build a case. A legitimate federal case requires chain of custody, requires authorization, requires a process he clearly is not following because he set up a civilian as an unwitting source without authorization, which means this entire operation is off the books. She leaned forward. Carter is not trying to prosecute your brother, Sung-ho. He's trying to eliminate him. There's a difference. And whatever Carter told you he would protect, he has no authority to protect anything because he's working outside his mandate. The silence that followed was very long. Sung-ho looked at the table. His hands had stopped pressing down and were now just resting, the unconscious shift of a body letting go of a held position. What do you want to do? He said finally. I want to give Carter what he thinks he's getting, she said, and make sure it destroys him instead. She was back at the Century City office by 4. Min Jae and Sung Jae were both there. She laid out everything Sung-ho had told her and then laid out what she wanted to do, and she did it in the flat, efficient language of a plan. Not a request, not a proposal, a plan, the way she laid out crisis management strategies, because that was what this was, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. The plan was this. They would not change anything visible. The gala proceeded as arranged. The press access remained. The strategic interviews remained. Sung-ho would appear to comply with Carter's request. He would access the venue's communications room and introduce a data package into the network. The data package would be one she built. You want to replace the documents, Sung Jae said. I want to replace them with a document set that looks, on initial examination, exactly like the 2019 to 2021 financial records Carter is expecting. It needs to be convincing enough to pass the first layer of journalist review. She looked at Min Jae. And then, when those journalists pull it and run it, and Carter believes the exposure is happening, the documents will also contain a second layer. What kind of second layer? Min Jae said. Records, she said. Of Carter's unauthorized operation. Surveillance logs from an unauthorized source. Me, without my knowledge. The credential issuance at Torrance. The communication pattern between Carter's office and a Knox referral chain that connects directly to him. The timeline of Marcus's debt being surfaced through creditors with federal adjacency. She looked at him steadily. Evidence that a federal investigator ran an off-book operation using a civilian, without authorization, to build a case that circumvented proper legal oversight. Not enough to convict him, but enough to make him radioactive, enough to end the investigation, enough to give your lawyers what they need to challenge every piece of evidence his task force has collected. The room was quiet. You'd be exposing yourself, Minjay said. Your own involvement, the fact that you were placed. Yes, she said. That implicates Daniel in your marriage, he said, in your divorce. In 6 years of... Yes, she said again, flatter. He looked at her. Why? Because it's what ends it, she said, and because I'm done being a tool in someone else's operation. Sungjae spent the rest of the evening building the data package with 2 people from his team she hadn't met before and who had the particular skill set the work required. She worked alongside them, not building the technical architecture, that wasn't her, but building the narrative architecture, the document structure that would read as legitimate financial records to a journalist working fast on a deadline at a gala, the layer underneath it that would read as a different story entirely when the same journalist looked more carefully 3 hours later. She worked until 11. She drove home. She slept 4 hours and dreamed about her father, which she hadn't done in years. Not his face, but his voice, the specific cadence of it, saying something she couldn't quite hear in the dream, but that she felt in her chest like a hand pressed flat. The gala was the next evening. She wore black. Not the burgundy. The burgundy was the night she'd chosen a dare, and she was done with dares. This was a choice. The dress was structured, minimal, the kind that communicated seriousness while still reading as appropriate for a charity benefit, and she had selected it with the same calculation she applied to every other element of the evening. She arrived at the Meridian Foundation venue at 6:15, 45 minutes before guests arrived. She walked the space with Sungjae, speaking quietly, confirming sight lines and the location of the communications room and the 3 entry points and the position of every member of Minjae's security detail who would be present in plain clothes. She located the 2 journalists she'd credentialed, both present, both early, both with the particular restless energy of people who had been told something was happening tonight without being told what. Carter's people. She was certain of it. She found Seung-ho near the bar at 6:40. He was in a dark suit and he looked like a man who had made a decision and was living in the aftermath of making it, the particular exhaustion of someone who has stopped arguing with themselves. The communications room, she said. Quiet. Beside him, not facing him. I'll go at 8:15, he said. During the keynote. The room will be empty. The package is ready, she said. Sungjae will get it to you before 8. Seung-ho was quiet for a moment. Then, if this doesn't work, it'll work. But if it doesn't, she looked at him sideways. Then I'm the one who gets hurt, she said. Not Minjae. The documents point at me and at Carter. Your brother stays clear either way. Seung-ho turned his head and looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that had something in it that wasn't hostility anymore and wasn't trust yet, but was something in the geography between them. He doesn't know you built it that way, Seung-ho said. No, she said. He'd argue with you about it. That's why he doesn't know. Minjae arrived at 6:55, and the room changed when he walked in. Not theatrically, not the way people perform importance, but the genuine and involuntary shift that happens in rooms when certain people enter them, when the air pressure changes slightly and everyone recalibrates without knowing they're doing it. He was in black, tie, and jacket, and he moved through the greeting lines with the specific controlled performance of a man doing something he was genuinely bad at and refusing to let it show. She caught his eye across the room at 7:10. He looked at her with the quality she'd learned by now, the one that looked at the underneath of things. She kept her expression level, giving him nothing to react to, giving him the face of someone who has a plan and is executing it. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he turned back to the foundation director who was explaining something enthusiastically about the charitable initiatives. The first hour was performance. She moved through the room doing her job, managing the journalists, positioning the interviews, ensuring the two strategic profiles were getting the access she'd arranged. She talked to 6 people she had never met and was warm and specific and entirely present because this was the other skill, the one people forgot she had, the one that had nothing to do with documents or strategies. She was very good at being in a room. At 7:55, she felt her phone vibrate. Sung-jae. One word, ready. She found Seong-ho near the entrance to the corridor that led to the venue's back rooms. She passed him without stopping, without eye contact, and pressed her palm briefly against his forearm as she walked past. The smallest possible contact, barely a touch. He understood it. She could tell from the way he absorbed it, the slight shift in his posture, the quality of someone who has been given a signal and will act on it. The keynote began at 8 o'clock. The Meridian Foundation's executive director took the stage, and the room settled into the particular attentive hush of 400 people performing their interest in a cause. The journalists were near the back, close to their exits, because journalists always stood near their exits. At 8:12, she saw one of them glance at his phone. At 8:14, the other one did the same. They'd been alerted. Carter had triggered something. He was watching the communications room, watching the network, waiting for Seong-ho's access. She looked toward the corridor. Seong-ho was already gone. She stood near the edge of the room with a glass of water. She was not drinking and watched the keynote and counted her own heartbeats in the specific way her father had taught her. Not to slow them, but to know them, to stay inside them, to be the person holding the beat rather than being held by it. 8:17. The journalist near the back looked at his phone. His expression changed. The small, controlled change of someone reading something they expected to find. The satisfaction of confirmation. He leaned to his colleague. The data package was in the network. She breathed. 8:22. Her phone vibrated. Not Sung-jae. Not Min-jae. A number she recognized as Carter's direct line, the same number that had called her from her car speaker a week ago. She stepped out through the side corridor. She answered. "You should have stayed out of it," Carter said. He did not sound calm. He sounded like a man who has looked at something and found it different from what he expected and is still deciding how to respond to that. "Whatever you put in that package is accurate," she said. "Amara, don't," she said. The same flat weight she'd used on Min-jae 2 weeks ago when he'd tried to parse language into acceptable increments. "Don't use my name like that. Not anymore." "You have no idea what you've just done," he said. "I've ended your operation," she said. "Without authorization, using a civilian as an unknowing source, compromising an active federal investigation through personal involvement. The documentation in that network right now goes to 3 places simultaneously. The journalists you planted, who are going to have a significantly more complicated story than the one you told them, your supervising office, and the oversight committee your task force reports to." She kept her voice even, kept it quiet. "You built this over years, Daniel. You were patient. You were organized. You just forgot that I spent 6 years learning exactly how people like you work, and I got a head start." Silence on the line. "Where are you?" he said. "That's not a question I'm going to answer," she said. "The evidence you used to build that package, some of it was obtained. Legally," she said. "All of it. I was careful. I was more careful than you were." She heard him breathe. Not the measured, patient breath of the man she'd been married to. Something shorter, something compressed. The sound of a calculation failing. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," she said. "You're off book. Your source, me, is compromised and hostile. Your planted journalists are about to receive documentation that implicates them in an unauthorized operation. Your task force is going to get the oversight report before midnight." She paused. "Go home, Daniel. It's over." She hung up. She stood in the side corridor for a moment with the phone in her hand and breathed in the specific way her father had taught her. Slow in. Hold. Slow out. Then she heard the shot. It was not loud. It was a suppressed shot, which was worse than loud in certain ways because it left a moment of confusion, a half second in which the brain didn't want to process what it had heard. And in that half second, there was a sound of something falling and a sound of movement, and then the room erupted. She was running before she'd made the decision to run. She came through the door from the corridor into the main hall, and the crowd was moving in that terrible directionless way that crowds move when they understand something has happened but not what. And she was going against the movement, pushing through, looking for the sightline to the stage where Minji had been standing for the last 20 minutes doing the interview she'd arranged. She saw Sungjae first. I was moving fast toward the right side of the stage, hand inside his jacket, and she tracked the direction of his attention and found the figure near the stage access stairs. A man she didn't recognize, already moving away, and something in the way he moved told her the shot had not come from him. It had come from above. She looked up. The venue had a mezzanine level, currently empty, the kind of architectural feature that exists in converted ballrooms for atmospherics and not much else. The mezzanine was dark. There was movement in the dark. She found the backstage access door because she had walked the venue with Sungjae, and she had made herself memorize every door. And she went through it and up the service stairs 2 at a time, and her heels were wrong for this, and she ran on the balls of her feet, and her legs were burning by the second landing. The mezzanine access was a door that should have been locked. It was not locked. This had been planned. Someone had unlocked it before the event. She pushed through. The mezzanine was long and dark, and the figure was at the far end, moving toward another exit, and she said stop, at a volume that was not a shout, but that carried, that had the quality of her father's voice in it, the command voice that she had absorbed over years of listening to a man who understood that volume is not the same as authority. The figure stopped, turned. She did not know the man. He was neither of the journalists, was no one she recognized from Carter's peripheral documentation, and he held the weapon loosely in a way that told her he was deciding whether the situation required him to use it again. She did not have a weapon. She had her phone, her training that was 15 years dormant but not gone, and the approximately 4 feet between them that were either enough or not. She said, "Carter sent you." The man's grip on the weapon shifted. "Carter's operation is already finished," she said. "The documentation went to oversight 20 minutes ago. If you fire that weapon in this room, you become the only active element of an unauthorized operation that has already been exposed and disavowed. You become the only person who can be prosecuted." She held his gaze. "He's not going to protect you. He's not in a position to protect anyone." The man's jaw moved, something working through him. "How bad?" she said. "Did it hit?" He understood what she was asking. "Shoulder," he said. One word, rough. Min-jae was alive. Shoulder. She filed this in the part of her brain that was keeping inventory and said, "Then there's still time to walk away from a situation that doesn't have to include a murder charge." He looked at her for a long moment that had about 30 different possible endings. Then he set the weapon on the railing of the mezzanine. He put his hands out to his sides. He turned and walked to the far exit with his hands still out, and she heard the door open and close, and then there was no sound from that direction. She picked up the weapon by the barrel. She descended the service stairs carefully. She came out into the main corridor where Sungjae met her with an expression that ran through 3 emotions in approximately 1 second. "Where is he?" she said. "Side room," Sungjae said. "Medical. He stopped. "He's conscious. He's angry." "Of course he is," she said. She handed the weapon to Sungjae by the barrel. He took it. She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. She found this neither reassuring nor surprising, her father's voice again, somewhere below conscious thought. Fear is information, not instruction. The side room was a venue staging area repurposed by necessity. 2 of Sungjae's people were there, and a woman who appeared to be applying pressure to a wound on Min-jae's right shoulder with the competence of someone who had done this before. Min-jae was sitting on a folding chair. His jacket was off. His shirt was open at the shoulder. His face was very white under the fluorescent light, and very controlled in the way that faces are controlled when the person wearing them is managing significant pain and is furious about needing to manage it. He looked at her when she walked in, the specific look, the one that went to the underneath. "You went up there," he said. "Yes." "Alone?" "There wasn't time for a committee." His jaw tightened. The woman pressing the bandage said something quietly in Korean. He didn't look away from Amara. "Carter," he said. "His operation is already in the oversight system," she said. "The shooter is gone." He stood down. She paused. "He's not Carter's person exactly. I think he's a contractor. I think Carter didn't anticipate that you'd survive the first attempt. and now he has a very complicated problem. Min-jae was quiet. He was breathing carefully, which she recognized as the controlled breath of someone managing pain without wanting to show how much there was. "Sung-ho," he said. "He did what he was supposed to," she said. "The package went in correctly. He came through." Something moved through Min-jae's expression. Something that was not information being processed, but something older than that, something that lived below the calculation. "You built the package to protect me," he said. "Sung-jae told me. The structure of it, the way it was designed to route the exposure toward Carter and away from the organization." "That was the point of the exercise," she said. "You exposed yourself," he said. "Your own involvement, your marriage. You put your own—" "It was necessary," she said. Amara. Her name again, the same weight as the first time in the conference room. "You could have built it differently." She looked at him, at the white face and the controlled pain and the dark eyes that had been looking at the underneath of her since the first night she'd stood in front of him in a nightclub and been the only object in a focused beam of light. "I know," she said. The door opened. Sung-ho came in. He stopped when he saw Min-jae, and the quality of the stop was complete. A man who has been carrying a weight and has just seen the full consequence of it, not in the abstract, but in blood and white skin and a chair in a fluorescent room. Min-jae looked at his brother. Sung-ho looked at Min-jae. What passed between them was not a conversation. It was something older than conversation, the communication of people who have the same blood and the same losses and a history that predates every calculation either of them has ever made. "I'm going to need to sit down with you," Min-jae said to his brother. His voice was rough. "After tonight." "I know," "No," Sung-ho said, "and I'm going to need you to tell me everything." "I know," Sung-ho said again. Outside the side room, the sound of sirens was getting closer. LAPD, and behind them, she suspected, federal presence that would be very carefully and publicly documented tonight by journalists who had received a story significantly more complicated than the one they'd been positioned to tell. She stood in the staging room and listened to the sirens and thought about Carter, somewhere in the city right now, making phone calls to people who could no longer help him, trying to collapse the structure of something that had already collapsed. She thought about the fact that she had built the exposure document to absorb the worst of the legal fallout herself, and that Min-jae had seen it and named it, and that she had said, "I know the way you say it when the decision is made and you're past the point of revising it." She thought about her father's voice saying, "Fear is information." She thought about a dare she had taken 8 days into her freedom, and the 3 seconds that had not been a beginning or an accident, but the visible tip of something that had been building for longer than she'd known, engineered by a man who understood her and had used that understanding as a mechanism. And she thought about the fact that despite all of it, despite the engineering, the manipulation, the careful construction of a situation she had believed was her own choice, she had made every decision in the last 2 weeks herself. The choice to find the truth, the choice to tell it, the choice to stand on a mezzanine with no weapon and talk a man down from using his. Those had been hers. Min-jae's eyes found her across the small room. She held his gaze. Outside, the sirens were very close now, and the night was not over, and there was still Carter, still the oversight process, still the legal architecture that would need to be managed in the weeks ahead, still the conversation between two brothers that had not yet happened, still a dozen things she could identify, and probably a dozen more she couldn't. But in this room, in this moment, she was standing on her own. The sirens arrived first, and then everything else arrived after them. 3 LAPD units, 2 unmarked federals, and an ambulance that Sung-jae had called before the shot had fully registered in the room. He was that kind of man, the kind who had already thought 3 steps ahead before the present moment finished happening. The paramedics came through the side entrance she showed them, and she stood in the corridor while they worked on Min-jae's shoulder and listened to the sounds of the main hall being managed. 400 people being calmly and professionally redirected toward exits, the particular low roar of a crowd being organized against its instinct to cluster around disaster. The 2 journalists were among the last to leave. She watched them go from the corridor doorway. Both of them had the look of people who had received a story they had not expected and were still sorting through what it meant. The second layer of the document package would have been visible to anyone looking carefully, and both of these people were careful. That was why Carter had planted them. And careful people did not know what to do yet with documentation that implicated the man who had pointed them here. That was intentional. She had designed the second layer to be legible, but not simple. She needed them to ask questions before they published anything. And people who have to ask questions take time, and time was what she needed tonight. The federal agents who arrived were not from Carter's task force. She confirmed this within 4 minutes of their arrival by asking Ji-hoon, who had materialized at some point in the last 30 minutes, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided his job tonight was to be whatever shape the situation required. The agents present were from the Oversight Office. Her documentation had moved faster than she'd hoped, or Carter had moved faster than she'd expected, or both, and the result was federal presence that was not hostile to Min Jae's organization, but was very specifically and pointedly interested in the organizational structure of an unauthorized task force and the identity of the individual who had run it. They spoke to her for 47 minutes in the venue's small administrative office, which smelled like old paper and someone's abandoned coffee. She answered every question directly. She showed them the documentation on her phone. Everything she had built, everything she had sourced, the complete timeline. She told them about the call from Carter. She told them about Daniel's voice and the patience in it, and the 6 years of a marriage she was now understanding as a different kind of architecture than she had believed it to be. She did not cry. She was aware of the option. It was present in the room the way a door is present in a room. She knew it was there, she simply did not open it. The agents thanked her at the end. One of them, a woman about 10 years older than Amara, with the particular economy of motion that comes from spending a career in rooms where efficiency is survival, looked at her for a moment after the formal exchange was over and said, quietly, and not for the record, "You built that package in under 48 hours." "Yes," Amara said. "With accurate sourcing." "Yes." The agent looked at her for another moment. Then she closed her notebook and left. Amara sat in the administrative office alone for approximately 4 minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the room be what it was. Small, papery, smelling of old coffee, without trying to make it mean something. Then she got up and went to find Min Jae. He was in the ambulance, which was still in the side alley because the paramedics were stabilizing him before transport, and he was, from what she could hear through the open doors, arguing with them about the necessity of transport in a quiet but absolutely implacable way. She climbed up the back step and looked in. He looked worse than he had in the staging room. The adrenaline that had been holding the color in his face had depleted, and what was left was the true accounting. Pale skin, a tightness around his eyes that she recognized as pain he was managing rather than pain he was not feeling, a bandage on his right shoulder that was doing its job but had not performed a miracle. The paramedic looked at her. She looked at the paramedic. "He needs to go," she said. "I'm aware of what I need," Min Jae said. "You've been shot," she said. "I'm aware of that also." Min Jae. Flat, the weight of it. "Get in the ambulance." He looked at her. The quality of it was the same as always, all of it, the full beam. But there was something different underneath, something that had nothing to do with assessment and everything to do with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running on compression for a long time and has just been given a reason to stop. "Sung-ho," he said. "Sung-jae has him," she said. "He's not going anywhere." "The agents are not here for you tonight," she said. "I made sure of that. Get in the ambulance." He held her gaze for another 3 seconds. Then, with the deliberateness of a man making a choice rather than conceding a point, he lay back. She stepped down from the ambulance. The doors closed. She watched it pull out of the alley and stood in the dark for a moment, in the quiet that follows the departure of sirens, the specific silence of an empty stage after the performance has ended and everyone has gone. Her feet hurt. She had been running on the balls of her feet up 2 flights of service stairs in heeled shoes, and the consequence of that was now presenting itself in a focused and direct way that she acknowledged and then set aside, because there was still work. She spent the next 2 hours at the venue working, not crisis management in the public sense. There was nothing to publicly manage yet. The story had not broken, and she was not going to be the one who broke it. But the internal logistics of an evening that had included a shooting, a federal document release, and the coordinated unraveling of an unauthorized federal operation. Ji-hoon managed the legal contact with Min Jae's attorneys. Sung-jae managed the physical security debrief and the weapon she'd retrieved from the mezzanine, which had been logged and would need to be formally accounted for. She managed everything else. She was good at everything else. At 11:40, she called Priya. Not to tell her anything specific. There was nothing she could responsibly say yet, and Priya would understand that. But because she needed to hear the voice again, the frequency of it, the particular human warmth of someone who knew her before all of this and would know her after. "Are you okay?" Priya said. She had picked up on the second ring. It was almost midnight. She had picked up anyway. "Not entirely," Amara said. "But I'm standing." "That's usually enough," Priya said. They talked for 6 minutes about nothing in particular. A movie Priya had seen, a problem with her building's elevator, the specific irritating behavior of a colleague whose name Amara did not retain. Normal things. The ordinary texture of a life that was not currently on fire. Amara listened to all of it and let it be exactly what it was. When she hung up, she sat in her car for a while before starting the engine. The venue's parking structure was mostly empty by now. The concrete columns were damp from the building's sprinkler system test earlier in the day, and the smell of it was the specific smell of concrete wet by intention rather than weather, clean in a utilitarian way. She thought about Daniel. She thought about the fact that she would need to think about Daniel for a significant period of time, through oversight processes and legal reviews and whatever came next, which she did not yet know the precise shape of but understood would be long and uncomfortable and require her to be precise and honest about things she would rather not be precise and honest about. She thought about 6 years. She did not make the mistake of calling it nothing. It was not nothing. Some of it had been real. She was able to hold both things at once, the manipulation and the reality, because people are not only their mechanisms, and a marriage is not only its foundation. She had loved him in the specific and limited way that you love someone when you don't fully know them, when the version you love is a construction made partly of truth and partly of your own need. That was human. That was not a failure. That was just the cost of living in proximity to other people without being able to see through them. What she was no longer willing to do was carry it as shame. She started the car at 12:15 and drove home. 3 days later, Daniel Carter was placed on administrative leave pending oversight review. The formal announcement came from his supervising office and said nothing specific, which was how these announcements always read. The precision of official language deployed to communicate without communicating, to contain information rather than release it. She read the announcement 3 times, not because she needed to, but because seeing it in official text required a different kind of processing than knowing it in advance. She called Ji-hoon to confirm the legal implications for Minji's organization. Ji-hoon confirmed. The task force's case materials were under review, which meant nothing currently gathered under Carter's unauthorized direction could be used in any subsequent proceeding, which meant the 8 months of investigation had effectively been voided. This did not mean Minji's organization was clean. She was very clear-eyed about this. She had never pretended otherwise, and Minji had never asked her to pretend. But it meant the specific and targeted threat that Carter had built was gone. Minji was in Cedars-Sinai for 2 days. She went to see him on the second day, the afternoon before his discharge, bringing coffee in the way that is less about the coffee, and more about having something to do with your hands when you enter a room where the emotional architecture is still under construction. The room was on the 4th floor. He was sitting up, which told her he had argued the nurses into it, and there was a tablet on the bed that told her he had been working, and the specific quality of his restlessness told her he had been in this room for approximately 36 hours too long. She sat in the chair beside the bed. She put the coffee on the table where he could reach it. He looked at her. The full quality of it. The beam. "Sungjae told me what you did on the mezzanine," he said. "Sungjae wasn't there," she said. "He talked to the contractor," Minjae said. "The man cooperated with the oversight investigation. Full disclosure," he paused. "You talked him down without a weapon." "I had accurate information, and he had diminishing options," she said. "It wasn't heroic, it was practical." "You were afraid," Minjae said. "Yes." "But you went up anyway." "You were shot," she said. "I wasn't going to stand in a corridor." He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the coffee. He drank it without looking at it, keeping his eyes on her, and she held his gaze and did not look away because she had stopped looking away from things she found difficult to look at. "The document package," he said. "We've covered this." "You built it to protect me," he said. "You absorbed the exposure that should have been distributed across the organization. It was more effective that way." "Amara." the weight of her name. Don't manage this. She looked at him. She breathed. You needed to be clear, she said. If the exposure landed on the organization's financials, the journalists would have had something to work with even after Carter was discredited. If it landed on me and on Carter, the story became about a federal investigator's unauthorized operation. That story protects you. It was the right structure. It was also the structure of someone willing to put herself between a threat and something she wanted to protect, he said. The room was very quiet. The hospital's ventilation system was different from the office buildings, softer, more insistent. I know what it was, she said finally. He set the coffee down. Sung-ho told me, he said, that you said you built it so I would stay clear regardless of whether it worked. That's accurate. He also told me that you told him he wasn't a traitor. He wasn't, she said. Carter manipulated him the same way he manipulated me. Different lever, same mechanism. Sung-ho loves his brother. Carter used that. Min-jae was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, the specific register of something he had been working toward and had arrived at. I knew Carter was connected to you before I approached your company, he said. I told you that. What I didn't tell you, what I should have told you, was that I knew it would bring him in. I knew that you working with us would be visible to him. I did not anticipate that he had arranged the initial contact, but He stopped. I was not entirely surprised when you became a target, and I should have told you the full risk before you walked into it. She looked at him. I used the leverage I had, he said. The information about your previous clients. That was real, but I could have presented the situation differently. I could have given you more of the picture and let you make a more informed choice. He held her gaze. I didn't, because I needed you and I didn't want to give you a reason to say no. She sat with this. That's the most honest thing you've said to me, she said finally. I'm aware it's also a significant admission, he said. It is, she said. Are you going to tell me whether it changes anything, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. At the white hospital room and the tablet with its open documents, and the man who looked at everything underneath and had used that quality, always and including on her, as a tool, and who was also sitting in a chair with a bullet wound in his shoulder, telling her the precise shape of his own calculation because she had asked him for honesty and he had decided to give it. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me something that isn't a yes or no question. How are you, he said. She thought about this. Functional, she said. Tired. My feet still hurt from the stairs. She paused. My ex-husband spent 6 years building an architecture around my life that I didn't know was there, and I'm not entirely finished processing what that means. Some days I'm clear on it. Some days it sits on my chest like something physical. He said nothing. He was listening with his whole body, the way she'd noticed he listened, the full quality of it. I'm not broken, she said. I want to be clear about that. I've been used by someone I trusted, and it was costly, and I am not going to pretend it wasn't. But the things I did in the last 2 weeks, the decisions I made, the work I built, those were mine. Even the decisions that were designed for me to make. When I made them, they were mine. Yes, he said, quietly. That matters to me, she said. I know, he said. I know that about you. She stood. She picked up her bag. She stood for a moment by the chair, not leaving yet. The organization, she said. The communication strategy. The legitimate businesses. There's still work to be done. The journalists with the documentation, the Torrance compliance gaps, the manufacturing union review. None of that is finished. No, he said. I'm going to need unrestricted access to the compliance team, she said. And I'm going to need Seong-ho to be present for the internal communications review, because he knows the organization's information architecture better than anyone else, and that knowledge needs to be part of the solution. I'll arrange it, Min-jae said. And I'm going to need you to stop making decisions about what information is relevant to my safety, she said. Because I understand that your instinct is to manage risk by managing proximity, but I need the full picture to do my job. And the next time you filter what I'm told to protect me, I will find out, and I will be significantly less reasonable about it than I'm being right now. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to the thing a smile comes from. Understood, he said. She left the hospital. She drove back to her office and worked until 7, and then went home and ate an actual meal at an actual table, which felt like an accomplishment that was disproportionately meaningful given the events of the preceding 2 weeks. She called her mother that night. Not about any of it. Not about Daniel, not about Min Jae, not about the gala, or the mezzanine, or the oversight investigation. She called because she had not called in 3 weeks, and her mother's voice had the particular quality of a thing she had been taking for granted, and had just been reminded was not a thing to take for granted. They talked for 40 minutes. Her mother asked how the company was doing. Amara said it was complicated and evolving. Her mother, who had been a school administrator for 30 years and had a highly calibrated tolerance for complicated and evolving, accepted this and moved on to other topics. At the end of the call, her mother said, "You sound different." "Different how?" Amara said. "More settled," her mother said. "Which is strange because you've sounded stressed for months. But now you sound, I don't know, like you're actually in the room you're standing in." Amara thought about this after she hung up, about the quality of being in the room you're standing in, about all the rooms she had stood in over the past 6 years while occupying a different room entirely. The room of a marriage that was a mechanism, the room of a career that was partially a cover, the room of a life she had built on assumptions about other people that had turned out to be wrong. She washed the dishes. She went to bed at 9:30. She slept 7 hours without dreaming about anything she could remember. The oversight review took 6 weeks. She was interviewed 4 times. Each interview was longer and more specific than the last, which she understood as the natural arc of an investigation that was finding more than it had expected to find. And she answered every question with the same directness she had brought to the first interview in the administrative office that smelled like old coffee. She retained her own attorney, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had been her first recommendation for clients in legal complexity and who now sat across from her instead of beside her and took very precise notes. The review found that Daniel Carter had operated an unauthorized intelligence gathering operation for 14 months, using an unregistered civilian source, Amara, without disclosure to his supervising office, in violation of federal operational guidelines. The finding also confirmed that the mechanism by which she had been introduced to Min Jae's organization, the surfacing of Marcus's debt through federal adjacent creditors, constituted unauthorized interference in private civil matters. Daniel's employment was terminated. Criminal referral was made to the Justice Department for further review. She was not charged with anything. Her involvement was characterized in the finding as that of an unwitting source subsequently acting in good faith to expose the unauthorized operation. She read the finding in Patricia's office on a Tuesday afternoon, sitting across from Patricia's desk in a chair that was significantly more comfortable than anything in the Century City conference room. And when she was done, she set it down and looked at the window and said nothing for a while. Patricia, who was a patient woman, waited. "It's accurate," Amara said finally. "Yes," Patricia said. "All of it." "All of it that matters," Patricia said with the particular precision of an attorney. Amara picked up the document again. She looked at Daniel's name in the formal language of the finding, the neutralizing grammar of official documents, which took a man she had loved in a specific and limited way for 6 years and processed him into a series of findings and violations and referrals. It was not satisfying. She had not expected it to be satisfying because satisfaction required an outcome that restored something, and this outcome did not restore 6 years. It only clarified them. She put the document in her bag. She thanked Patricia. She walked out into the afternoon. Marcus came back to the company 2 months after the gala. Not to the same position, they had both agreed, without particularly needing to discuss it, that 40% equity and operations management were not the right architecture anymore. He came back as a senior consultant, which was a title that meant he did the work he was actually good at without the burden of ownership he had not been able to carry. He was 3 months into a support program for the gambling. He was doing the work. She could see it in the way he moved through the office, more present, less defended. One afternoon, she found him at his desk with the particular expression of someone doing something they are not proud of but cannot stop doing, which she recognized because she had worn the same expression herself for months. "It's going to be a long road," she said. "I know," he said. "You should have told me," she said, not as an accusation, as a fact she needed to say once more so they could both hear it cleanly and then leave it alone. "I know," he said. "Okay," she said, and went back to her office. The Torrance manufacturing facility passed its union safety review in the 7th week. The compliance gaps she had identified were addressed with the particular efficiency of organizations that understand the cost of not addressing them. And the result was a facility that was not perfect but was documentable and honest, which she had learned was often more valuable than perfect. The longer-form investigative journalist published his piece 11 weeks after the gala. It was about Carter's unauthorized operation, about the use of civilian sources in federal investigations, about the structural vulnerabilities and oversight mechanisms that allow unauthorized operations to persist for 14 months before exposure. It was careful and long and accurate. It mentioned Junhua Capital twice as background context, in ways that were factual and not catastrophic. She read it at her desk and then sent the journalist a one-line email. Accurate. Thank you for being careful. He replied the next morning. Thank you for the second layer. She and Min Jae settled into a working relationship that was nothing like what she had imagined on the morning she sat at her desk and waited for him to arrive at 9 o'clock. It was more demanding than that, and also more honest than that, which were the same thing, she was finding, more often than not. He argued with her communication strategies with the persistence of someone who had spent his entire life constructing a different kind of strategy and found hers instinctively alien. She argued back with the efficiency of someone who was not interested in winning arguments but was very interested in being right. He was usually wrong about messaging and usually right about human nature, which was an infuriating combination. She began to understand his organization better than she had expected to. Not to love it or to tell herself stories about its cleanliness. She was not going to do that. She had promised herself that much. But to understand it with the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who has decided to work with the material as it is, rather than as she would prefer it to be. The people employed by the legitimate businesses were real people doing real work. The charitable foundation the Meridian Benefit had been supporting was, after she reviewed its financials and its programs, genuinely functional and genuinely useful in the communities it served. These facts did not erase other facts. They existed alongside them. She held both. She had gotten good at holding both. Seung-ho was harder. The internal communications review she had insisted on was 3 weeks of conversations she found alternately useful and grinding. Seung-ho had the same fundamental quality as his brother, the same habit of looking at the underneath of things, but carried it with a guardedness that had been built from a different experience of the same world. He had spent his life managing what his brother meant to other people, which was its own form of exhaustion, and Carter had found that exhaustion and used it with precision. The conversation she had not expected to have with Seung-ho happened on a Thursday evening in the Koreatown office, after the formal review sessions had concluded. She had stayed late to finish something, and he had come back for something he'd left, and they had found themselves in the corridor with nothing between them except the length of the past 3 months. I owe you an apology, he said. First. She looked at him. You were lied to, she said. I was also looking for a reason to believe it, he said. The honesty of it was precise, the kind of honesty that cost something. Carter told me you were a plant and I wanted it to be true, because if it was true, then the problem of you was manageable. A person with an agenda you can counter. That's easier than the other thing. What other thing? She said. He looked at her steadily. A person my brother Cho, he said, who is not what I expected and who I cannot protect him from in any ordinary way. She held his gaze. He's not something that needs protecting, she said. He's something that needs... She stopped. Found the word. Room, she said. He needs room to be something other than what his reputation requires. Seung-ho was quiet. Then, you give him that. I argue with him constantly, she said. Yes, Seung-ho said. That's what I mean. The light in the corridor was yellow and not particularly flattering to anyone. It was an entirely uncinematic moment, 2 people standing in a hallway after a long day talking about a third person they both cared about, in different and occasionally conflicting ways. She thought that most of the important conversations she had been part of in the last 4 months had occurred in exactly these kinds of settings. Administrative offices, hospital rooms, building corridors, kitchen counters at 11:30 at night, and that the absence of appropriate scenery did not make them less true. We're not going to be easy, she told him. No, Seung-ho said. But I'm not going anywhere, she said. So we might as well figure out how to be something better than adversarial. He looked at her for a moment. Then, not warmly exactly, but with a quality that was the beginning of what warmth requires. Agreed. The conversation with Min-jae that she had been not quite having for 4 months happened at the end of a working Thursday in the Century City office. After Ji-hoon had left, and the 4 people at the desks had gone, and the building's ventilation had shifted into its nighttime register. She had stayed to finish the final draft of the Junhua Capital Public Communications Framework, a comprehensive document that would serve as the foundation for everything going forward, the position statements and the media protocols and the community engagement strategy and the language guidelines. It was the best work she had done. She knew it was the best work she had done, not with vanity, but with the clear assessment of a person who has been doing something long enough to know the difference between good and exceptional. She was closing her laptop when he appeared in the conference room doorway. He was in his jacket, but had discarded the tie at some point in the day, and his right shoulder carried the slight compensating angle that had become habitual in the weeks since the surgery. Not a limp, not a weakness, just a permanent recalibration of how he moved through space, which she had watched him incorporate with the same lack of self-pity he applied to everything. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. He came into the room. He looked at the closed laptop. "The framework." "Complete," she said. "Ji-hoon has the final version." He stood on the other side of the table from her, not sitting, present in the room with the specific quality she had learned to recognize as him being exactly where he intended to be. "The Knox," he said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about going back," he said, "not for any particular reason, because it's where things started and I want to see it again." He held her gaze. "I thought you might want to as well." She thought about the night, the burgundy dress, Kemi's enormous grin, the dare she had taken because she was 8 days out of a marriage that had been a mechanism and she was sick of being careful, the quality of 3 seconds and the feeling afterward of having been seen all the way through by someone she had no language for. She thought about what the night had actually been, the arrangement behind it, Carter's patient construction, the mechanism that had been turning for years before she walked into a room she had been guided toward. She thought about what it would mean to go back, not to restore it or reinterpret it or give it a different meaning than it had, just to stand in the same room and know the whole story and choose to be there anyway. "When?" she said. "Friday," he said. She considered this. "I'm not wearing the burgundy dress," she said. "I don't care what you wear," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you for my own reasons." The corner of his mouth moved, the almost smile. She had catalogued every iteration of it over 4 months, the way it appeared and receded and what it indicated about the thought it accompanied. It was one of the few involuntary things about him, one of the small failures of control that told her something real was working underneath. They went on Friday. The club was the same. The music was different, but the register was the same. Deep, deliberate, the kind of sound that changes the quality of air. The same neon. The same elevated sections and the particular architecture of a room that has been designed to make certain people visible and everyone else a context for that visibility. She wore something dark and simple. He wore what he always wore, a suit that communicated nothing except that he did not need to communicate through it. They stood near the bar, not at a table, and he looked at the room with the patient attention she knew now was not surveillance but habit. The habit of a man who learned early that rooms have their own information and that the information was worth reading. "You were at a table," she'd said. "Back left." "You came from that direction," he said, tilting his chin toward the main entrance. "Your friends were at the booth along the far wall. You tracked us from the entrance." "I track everyone from the entrance," he said. "That's not reassuring," she said. "It's not meant to be reassuring," he said. "It's just what I do." She looked at the room. At the people in it, the specific texture of a Friday night social architecture. People performing their best versions of themselves. People genuinely having the experiences they were performing. People watching other people and trying to determine which category they were in. The ordinary, complicated theater of a room full of strangers. "I was terrified," she said, "when I walked across that room. I don't think I admitted that at the time." "You didn't look it," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the thing you learn early when you're black and a woman in rooms where neither is the default. You perform the confidence until it becomes real, and you perform it so well that sometimes you convince yourself you weren't afraid in the first place. She looked at the back left area where his table had been. I was afraid. My knees were shaking. I did it anyway because I was so tired of being careful and getting nothing for it. He was quiet. I was listening with his whole body. And then you told me I had no idea what I'd started, she said. I didn't know yet either, he said. I thought I did. I thought you were someone Carter had sent, someone testing something. I was wrong. You were also wrong to use the leverage the way you did, she said. Renner, Alston, Senator Holt, using that information to trap me into working for you. Yes, he said. No qualification. I'm not going to keep relitigating it, she said. I said what I needed to say about it, and I'm choosing not to carry it as a permanent debt between us. But I wanted to say it here, in this room, because it happened near here, and I needed it said in the same geography. I understand, he said. She turned and looked at him directly. In the neon and the low light, his face was the same as it had been 4 months ago. Angular, composed, the same compressed quality underneath the stillness. He was not a different man than the one who had used what he knew to trap her into a situation that served his needs. He was also not only that man. She held this the same way she held everything else that came in 2 layers. I'm here because I chose to be here, she said. Not because of the dare. Not because of the leverage. Not because of Carter's arrangement. I know all of those things now, and I'm here anyway, and I needed you to know that the choice is mine. He looked at her, the full quality of it. I know, he said. Do you? She said. You've been telling me since the second morning, he said. Every decision you've made has been exactly that, yours. Even the ones I tried to structure toward a particular outcome. The corner of his mouth again. You structured them differently. I usually do, she said. They stood in the bar for another hour. They drank. They talked about the organization and about the framework and about the Torrance facility's next review cycle and about a property in Seattle that Ji-hoon thought was worth developing and that Min-jae was skeptical of and that she thought had potential if the communications approach was correctly calibrated. They talked about work because work was what they understood between them, the clearest language they had, the place where everything else became concrete and manageable. At some point, the conversation shifted, as it sometimes shifted now, into something quieter, less about work, more about the underneath of things, which was where he had always looked and where she had learned, against her own instincts, to look also. He talked about his father, not in depth. He was not a man who talked about his father in depth, and she did not require it, but in the specific and limited way that people talk about formative things when they trust the person they're talking to with the fact of the thing without necessarily trusting them with the whole of it. His father had been a man who built things and lost them and built them again, and the building had cost the family things that did not grow back. And Min-jae had spent his life trying to build something that would not require that cost, and had arrived at 38 understanding that the cost was structural, that it lived in the nature of what he was, and that he had been trying to build something different for 3 years and had not entirely known whether it was possible until recently. She listened. She did not fill the pauses with comfort. She let the pauses be pauses. My father would have found you terrifying, she said when he was finished. Because of the organization, he said. Because you're exactly the kind of man he raised me to be able to handle, she said. And he would have spent the first hour cataloging your threat profile and the second hour being furious with himself for respecting it. Min-jae looked at her. He sounds like someone I would have gotten along with, he said. You would have, she said. He would have denied it strenuously. She looked around the room one more time. The neon, the music, the specific quality of a place that held a memory she had arrived at incorrectly and was now standing inside correctly, knowing everything she hadn't known and making the same choice she would have made if she'd known it all along. Some choices were like that. The information didn't change them. You kept arriving at the same place by different roads. I'm going to keep arguing with your communication strategies, she said. I know, he said, and I'm going to need Seung-ho to stop CCing Ji-hoon on everything he sends me because it creates a documentation redundancy that's going to be a problem during the next regulatory review. I'll talk to him, he said, and I'm going to need you to not make unilateral decisions about what information is relevant to my safety, she said. We've covered this. We've covered it, he agreed. Are you going to remember it? She said. I'll try, he said. I'm better at some things than others. I know, she said. I'm keeping track. She put down her glass. She looked at him in the neon light, at the man who had looked at the underneath of things from the first night, and had been right about most of what he saw and wrong about the rest of it, and had told her, in a hospital room with a bullet wound in his shoulder, the precise shape of his own calculation, which was not the same as virtue, was not the same as goodness, but was something she had found she could work with, because honesty was a foundation, and she had learned the hard way what happened when the foundation was something else. I have an early call tomorrow, she said. I know, he said. Ji-hoon scheduled it. Then take me home, she said. Not as a question, as a choice she was making clearly and without ambiguity, with the full information of everything she knew. He looked at her for a moment. The almost smile arrived, and this time it completed itself, brief and real and slightly surprised by its own existence, which was the most honest thing she had seen on his face in 4 months. Yes, he said. They walked out of Knox into the Los Angeles night, which was the same city it had always been, enormous, indifferent, full of people making choices with incomplete information in rooms where the stakes were higher than they appeared. The same neon on the street, the same warm air that smelled of concrete and exhaust and jasmine from someone's overgrown hedge 2 doors down. She had come into this city 12 years ago with 2 suitcases and an ambition that had no ceiling, and she had built something real from it, and she had lost pieces of it to people who had seen the real thing and decided it was something they could use. And she had taken those pieces back, not all of them, not cleanly, but in the specific and costly way that things are recovered when the recovering is done by the person they belong to. She was not the woman who had walked into Knox on a dare. She was not the woman who had sat at her desk and waited at 8:43 for a man she did not yet know the full shape of. She was the woman who had stood on a mezzanine in the dark with no weapon and talked a man down from using his, and who had built a document structure in 48 hours that ended a 14-month unauthorized federal operation, and who had looked at the full truth of a 6-year marriage and carried it without collapsing under it, and who stood now on a Los Angeles sidewalk at 11:15 on a Friday night, and knew, with the clear and unperfect knowledge of someone who has arrived at something by the wrong road and arrived nonetheless, that she was standing in the right place. She made her own choices. She always had. She was simply better at knowing it